What if the most extraordinary conversation of your life wasn't with another person, but with a voice that came from within you? Imagine sitting alone, staring into the quiet of your own thoughts. A fragment of a dream lingers, a strange image flashes, or a sudden memory rises. Instead of brushing it aside, you let it speak. You ask questions, you listen, and slowly, that fragment becomes a figure. It talks back. It argues. It reveals things you did not know you knew. This is not madness. This is a technique. And for Carl Jung, it became the doorway to creativity, self-discovery, and even survival. At the height of his life, Jung faced what he called a confrontation with the unconscious. After breaking with Freud, he felt himself collapsing into inner chaos. But rather than retreat from it, he descended. He wrote, he painted, he dialogued with figures that rose from his imagination. From this struggle came his Red Book, a document so strange and powerful that he kept it hidden for decades. And from this struggle came the method he called active imagination. Active imagination is not fantasy. It is not idle daydream. It is the conscious practice of entering into dialogue with the unconscious, of treating images, emotions, and inner figures as living presences with something to teach. To engage with them is to access a reservoir of creativity and wisdom buried beneath the surface of ordinary thought. Think of how often inspiration feels like it comes from nowhere: an artist suddenly struck with vision, a writer haunted by a character, a scientist guided by intuition. Jung believed these were not accidents, but glimpses of a deeper process. With active imagination, we do not wait for inspiration to arrive. We enter its world. We invite the unconscious into conversation, and in doing so, we open a channel to creativity that is not random but intentional. But this practice is not without risk. The unconscious contains not only muses but shadows. To open dialogue is to face parts of ourselves we often avoid: anger, envy, desire, fear. Yet it is here that the greatest breakthroughs emerge. Creativity without shadow is shallow. True genius, Jung believed, comes from integrating both light and darkness. This is the story we will explore: how active imagination has been used to fuel art, innovation, self-discovery, and healing. How it connects to the myths we tell, the archetypes we embody, and the shadows we carry. And how, if practiced carefully, it can unlock the creative genius living inside each of us. If you've ever felt blocked, uninspired, or uncertain of your own inner voice, this journey is for you. What follows is not a lecture, but an exploration of Jung's descent into the unconscious, of the techniques he developed, and of the practical ways you can apply them to your own life. Stay with me as we uncover how artists, writers, and thinkers across history tapped into the same reservoir of inner dialogue that Jung named active imagination. By the end, you'll have not only the understanding of this method, but the tools to begin practicing it yourself. If you value deep ideas, if you crave creativity rooted in authenticity rather than surface tricks, consider subscribing, sharing your thoughts, and joining this community of thinkers and seekers. Each comment, each reflection, becomes part of the dialogue we are all engaged in. The unconscious is vast, and it is waiting. Together, let's learn how to enter its depths, not to lose ourselves, but to discover what has been there all along. Breaking away from Freud in the autumn of 1913, Carl Gustav Jung's world began to fracture. Outwardly, he was at the height of his career, a respected psychiatrist in Zurich, well connected in European intellectual circles, with a growing reputation as one of the brightest minds of his generation. He was only in his late 30s, yet he had already lectured internationally, written extensively, and presided as president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. To many, he was the clear heir to Sigmund Freud, the man who had founded psychoanalysis and ignited a revolution in understanding the human mind. But beneath the professional success was turbulence. Jung had been drawn to Freud initially by a deep admiration. Their first meeting in Vienna in 1907 had lasted 13 hours, a marathon conversation in which both men felt they had discovered in each other a kindred spirit. Freud was nearly 20 years older, already a legendary figure, and Jung quickly became not just a disciple but a surrogate son. Their bond had an intensity that went beyond ordinary friendship. For Freud, Jung represented the future of psychoanalysis, a fresh voice who could carry his ideas beyond the insular world of Jewish Viennese intellectual life into broader European respectability. For Jung, Freud was both mentor and father figure, the authority he longed to impress and the guide who seemed to anchor his restless intellect. Yet this closeness came with its dangers. Relationships bound by projection, where one sees in another not simply a person but a symbol, rarely endure without rupture. As Jung's thinking matured, he grew restless with Freud's insistence that sexuality was the central key to all human psychology. Jung did not deny the importance of sex, but he believed the psyche was larger, more symbolic, and more mysterious than Freud's reductionism allowed. Dreams, myths, religions, visions, these could not be explained away as disguised expressions of libido. They carried meanings that touched something collective, something archetype. The disagreements between them multiplied. Freud wanted disciples who would protect his theoretical edifice. Jung wanted exploration, freedom, and expansion. Tension grew as their correspondence turned from admiration to frustration. Freud accused Jung of mysticism, Jung accused Freud of narrowness. By 1912, the rift was clear. When Jung published Symbols of Transformation, a book that argued myths and dreams pointed not simply to sexuality but to spiritual processes of transformation, Freud saw it as betrayal. The book was brilliant, but it dismantled the very foundation of Freud's system. By 1913, their friendship collapsed. Jung resigned from the International Psychoanalytic Association, stepping down from the very position Freud had once groomed him for. What had once been a father-son bond now lay in ruins. For Jung, the loss was not merely professional but existential. He later admitted that this break triggered the most profound crisis of his life. In the silence that followed, Jung felt adrift. He had broken from Freud, but what had he stepped into? His reputation suffered. Former colleagues turned away. He was labeled a deserter, even a heretic. For a man who had once been the golden child of psychoanalysis, the isolation was brutal. And then came the visions. Jung began to see images that terrified. He wrote of rivers of blood flooding across Europe, of corpses floating in crimson waters, of entire nations burning in fire. At first, he thought these were signs of psychosis. He was a psychiatrist, after all, trained to recognize the symptoms of mental collapse. He feared he might be losing his grip on reality. But something in him resisted the easy explanation. These images did not feel like random hallucinations. They carried weight, gravity, the sense of something larger than himself pressing into awareness. And in 1914, when the First World War broke out and Europe was indeed drenched in blood, Jung realized that his visions were not merely personal. They had carried a collective dimension. His unconscious, it seemed, had anticipated the catastrophe that would engulf the continent. This realization terrified him even more. If his unconscious could produce visions with such force and such accuracy, what else might it reveal? Would he survive what it had to show him, or would he be consumed by it? This was the moment Jung faced a choice: suppress the images, medicate them, dismiss them as madness, or engage them directly. In a move that few would have dared, he chose engagement. He decided to descend into his own unconscious deliberately, to see where it would lead. He did not know if he would return with insight or collapse entirely, but he knew he had no choice. To ignore the voices rising within him was to risk being destroyed by them. To face them was to risk madness, but also to uncover something essential. This decision marked the beginning of what Jung later called his confrontation with the unconscious. For years, he would struggle with visions, dreams, and dialogues with inner figures, recording them in journals that would eventually become his Red Book. It was a period of darkness and discovery, of fear and fascination, of walking the razor's edge between genius and psychosis. To break away from Freud was to break away from safety. Freud had been an anchor, a guide, a father. Without him, Jung entered uncharted territory. Yet it was only in this rupture that Jung could discover his own path. Creativity is often born from loss. For Jung, the collapse of his friendship with Freud was the necessary wound that opened the way to his greatest insights. And so the descent began, not as a philosophical experiment, but as a fight for survival. In the silence left by Freud's absence, the unconscious spoke, and Jung, instead of turning away, dared to listen. Dreams, visions, and the Red Book. When Jung made the decision to turn toward his visions rather than away from them, he crossed a threshold few psychologists had ever dared to approach. The unconscious was no longer an abstract theory. It was alive, pressing against the edges of his daily life, demanding engagement. To keep his sanity, Jung needed to find a way to give form to the chaos. He turned first to his most natural tools, writing and drawing, and what emerged became one of the strangest and most profound documents of the 20th century, the Red Book. The Red Book was not a diary in the conventional sense. It was a record of dialogues, painted visions, and symbolic landscapes, set down with the care of someone creating a sacred manuscript. Thick with illustrations, mandalas, and calligraphic text, it reads like scripture written from the depths of a dream. Jung did not publish it during his lifetime. He feared the world would mistake it for insanity. For decades it remained locked away, seen only by a few close associates. When it was finally published in 2009, nearly 50 years after his death, readers discovered not a treatise but a mythic journey into the human soul. The visions that fill the Red Book were often terrifying. Jung described rivers of blood, seas of fire, cities collapsing, and the dead walking among the living. He encountered grotesque figures, serpents, prophets, and gods. Yet alongside the horror, there were moments of awe and beauty, radiant mandalas, angelic figures, and archetypal guides. The pages are filled with contradictions, images of death alongside symbols of rebirth, despair woven with hope. These visions did not come at night but intruded into his waking hours. Jung sometimes sat at his desk or in his study and simply allowed them to unfold. He did not try to repress them. Instead, he asked, "What do they mean? What part of myself, What part of humanity is speaking here? He treated each vision as a message coded in symbols, and in the act of painting and writing them, he gave them a shape that could be contemplated, studied, and reflected upon. The Red Book reveals the raw process of what Jung later called active imagination. He would begin with an image or an emotion, say, a sense of dread or a fragment from a dream. Instead of dismissing it, he would allow it to develop. He would imagine himself entering the scene. If a figure appeared, he would speak with it, listen to its answers, and record the exchange. He treated these figures not as hallucinations but as parts of the psyche with their own voices and perspectives. Some of these dialogues are deeply unsettling. Jung argued with hostile figures that insulted him, ridiculed his work, and threatened his stability. Others were tender, offering encouragement or wisdom. He did not shy away from either. Every figure was given the chance to speak. Every vision was respected. Over time, these encounters began to reveal patterns, recurring archetypes that seemed to embody universal aspects of human experience. It was here, in these dialogues, that Jung first recognized the reality of the archetypes. The shadow, the wise old man, the child, the anima. These were not yet formal theories. They were living presences on the pages of the Red Book. They rose from his imagination with startling autonomy, each carrying a unique voice. What Jung later codified into his psychology began not in the clinic but in these personal encounters. The sheer artistry of the Red Book reflects the seriousness with which Jung treated the process. He illuminated the pages with mandalas, circular symbols of wholeness that appeared spontaneously in his visions. He painted figures with mythic resonance, serpents, suns, gods, demons, and landscapes that looked like scenes from forgotten religions. Each painting was not decorative but symbolic, an attempt to capture in form what the unconscious revealed in image. Why did Jung risk so much time and energy on this? Because he believed the alternative was destruction. If he suppressed the visions, they would devour him. By engaging them creatively, he transformed them from chaos into meaning. What threatened to unravel his sanity became the foundation of his life's work. The Red Book also shows the paradox of the unconscious. It is at once deeply personal and strikingly collective. Jung's visions of blood and destruction horrified, yet when World War I erupted soon after, he realized these images reflected not only his own fears but the collective psyche of Europe on the brink of collapse. His unconscious had carried a cultural truth, expressed symbolically before history confirmed it. For Jung, this confirmed that the unconscious was not merely private, it was a collective reservoir of images and patterns that connected individuals to humanity as a whole. There is suspense woven into every page of the Red Book. One feels Jung teetering on the edge of revelation and madness. He confessed later that he often wondered whether he was doing science or writing poetry. To the outside world, it might have looked like delusion, but for Jung, the visions carried a reality deeper than literal fact. They were symbolic truths, revealing the architecture of the psyche in ways logic could not. The Red Book is strange, even unsettling, but it is also profoundly human. It shows what happens when someone refuses to turn away from their inner world. Jung's decision to write, paint, and dialogue with the unconscious transformed his crisis into creation. Out of the pages came not only survival but insight that would later shape the concepts of archetypes, the collective unconscious, and individuation. For Jung, the Red Book was never meant to be a public performance. It was private, intimate, a record of survival, but in its secrecy lies its authenticity. It was not written to impress but to endure, and perhaps that is why, when finally revealed, it resonated so deeply. It is not a polished theory but a human confession, a record of a man grappling with visions most would have denied or suppressed. The lesson is stark: when the unconscious erupts, we face a choice. We can repress it, medicate it, flee from it, or we can engage it. Jung chose engagement. The Red Book is the evidence of what that choice produced: a strange, beautiful, terrifying, and transformative dialogue with the depths of the psyche. And in those depths, Jung discovered that creativity and survival were not separate. They were the same act. To paint, to write, to give form to the visions was not an escape from madness. It was the very thing that kept him sane. Dialogues with archetypal figures. As Jung immersed himself in the practice of active imagination, the images that rose from the depths began to take on lives of their own. They were not vague impressions or fleeting dream fragments. They were figures, speaking, arguing, teaching, mocking, each with a distinct personality. They felt autonomous, as if they had their own will. Jung treated them with the seriousness of living beings, though he knew they came from within. These were archetypes, rising from the collective unconscious, demanding dialogue. One of the most significant was Philemon. He appeared as an old man with wings, carrying the authority of a sage. Jung felt that Philemon's words carried insights beyond his conscious knowledge. Philemon explained things Jung had not thought through, gave perspectives that startled him, and seemed to stand as an independent source of wisdom. For Jung, Philemon represented the archetype of the wise old man, the guide who appears in myths across cultures: Merlin, Odin, Hermes, prophets and mentors who lead seekers toward truth. Philemon reminded Jung that the unconscious was not only a repository of fears but also of guidance. Yet not all the figures were benevolent. Jung also met hostile presences, the embodiment of his shadow. These figures criticized him harshly, mocked his pretensions, and confronted him with truths he did not want to hear. They were cruel, but their cruelty carried purpose. They forced Jung to face his arrogance, his ambitions, his repressions. The shadow's voice was not easy to bear, but it revealed what Jung most needed to integrate. Without dialogue, the shadow would remain a destructive force in the background. Through conversation, it became a teacher. He also encountered his anima, the feminine dimension of his psyche. She appeared in many forms, sometimes alluring, sometimes frustrating, always enigmatic. Jung realized that much of what men project onto women in relationships comes from this inner archetype. By meeting the anima within, he reduced the unconscious compulsion to demand from women what was really part of himself. For women, the same principle holds with the animus, the inner masculine figure. These encounters revealed how much of love and attraction is shaped not by reality but by projection. Another figure that emerged was the child. At times, it appeared as vulnerable and in need of protection. At other times, it was playful, curious, creative. The child reminded Jung of potential and renewal, the part of the psyche that carries innocence and possibility. In moments of despair, the child symbolized the hope of beginning again. For artists and innovators, reconnecting with this figure is essential. It is the wellspring of curiosity, the energy of play that fuels creation. Then came the trickster. This figure unsettled Jung, ridiculing him, mocking seriousness, breaking his assumptions. The trickster is universal in myth, Loki in Norse tales, Hermes in Greek myth, the jester in medieval courts. In imagination, the trickster destabilizes order, sometimes cruelly, but often with purpose. It reveals illusions, forces flexibility, and breaks the rigid patterns that keep us stuck. Jung recognized that the trickster, though irritating, was essential for growth. The dialogues were not passive fantasies. They were confrontations, sometimes tender, sometimes brutal. Jung argued, resisted, defended himself, but he always returned to the figures, treating them as worthy of respect. He did not try to dominate or silence them, nor did he surrender blindly. He engaged in dialogue, a balance of listening and questioning. The process was uncanny. Imagine sitting at your desk, closing your eyes, and seeing a figure rise before you. You ask, "Who are you?" And the figure replies with words that surprise you, even shock you, as though another mind is speaking through your own. This was Jung's daily reality. He confessed later that he often wondered whether he was writing science or writing myth, but he trusted the authenticity of the experience. The very unpredictability of the figures convinced him that they carried truths beyond his conscious control. Through these dialogues, Jung began to see that the unconscious is not random chaos but structured by archetypes. These figures, recurring across cultures and myths, emerged spontaneously in his visions. They were the same characters that populate stories, legends, and religions. The wise guide, the shadow enemy, the anima lover, the trickster fool, the child of renewal, they live in humanity's collective memory, surfacing whenever imagination is allowed to speak. Jung's breakthrough was to realize they also live within each of us. For creativity, the implications are profound. Writers often say that characters speak to them, developing in ways the author did not plan. Artists describe being guided by images that seem to appear from nowhere. Scientists report breakthroughs arriving in dreams or flashes of intuition. Jung would argue that all these are moments when archetypal figures rise to consciousness. Active imagination provides a way to meet them deliberately rather than waiting passive. But these encounters were not only about creativity, they were also about self-knowledge. By meeting Philemon, Jung discovered his inner guide. By confronting the shadow, he faced his hidden arrogance and ambition. By dialoguing with the anima, he recognized how projection shaped his relationships. By listening to the child, he remembered the vitality of curiosity. By enduring the trickster, he learned the necessity of humility. Each figure carried a fragment of the self that, once integrated, brought greater wholeness. The Stoics, though they never practiced active imagination in Jung's sense, would have understood the value of such dialogues. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, often wrote as though speaking to inner voices, correcting himself, questioning impulses. Seneca urged daily self-examination, a kind of conversation with the parts of oneself that needed discipline. Epictetus reminded his students that it is not events themselves but our judgment about them that disturb us. All of this echoes the spirit of Jung's dialogues, the recognition that the mind is filled with competing voices, and that wisdom comes from engaging them consciously. In Jung's practice, these voices were dramatized as archetypal figures, but whether we imagine them as gods, dreams, or inner characters, the principle remains: to ignore them is to be governed by them unconsciously. To dialogue with them is to reclaim power. Jung's dialogues with archetypal figures were unsettling, often frightening, but they were also transformative. They revealed that the unconscious is not an enemy to silence but a partner to engage. Out of those conversations came not only survival but the seeds of his greatest ideas, the collective unconscious, the archetypes, and the process of individuation. To read the Red Book is to witness these dialogues firsthand. To practice active imagination is to enter into your own. And the question remains, what figures wait in your depths, and what might they say if you dared to ask? Risk and reward. Every descent carries danger. For Jung, the greatest risk of entering the unconscious was simple: he might not return. He knew, as a psychiatrist, how fragile the line was between vision and delusion, between revelation and psychosis. The same inner material that he was exploring had destroyed patients he had once treated, men and women overwhelmed by hallucinations, consumed by voices, lost in inner landscapes they could not control. To turn deliberately toward the unconscious was to walk a razor's edge. Jung confessed in later years that he often feared he had gone too far. The images were so vivid, the figures so insistent, that he wondered whether he was slipping into madness. Friends noticed the strain, his family worried about. He spent hours alone, absorbed in dialogues with voices that no one else could hear. To the outside world, it might have looked indistinguishable from psychosis, yet the difference lay in how he approached it. Jung did not surrender blindly to the visions. He engaged them with discipline. He wrote them down, painted them, contained them within the pages of his journals. He insisted on grounding himself afterward in ordinary life, teaching, treating patients, gardening, cooking meals with his family. These everyday acts became lifelines, anchors pulling him back from the abyss. Without them, he admitted, he might have been consumed. This was the essential balance: to enter the depths without losing the surface, to listen to the unconscious without identifying with, to dialogue with figures without mistaking them for external gods. The risk was real, but the reward, as Jung discovered, was extraordinary. From his descent came the seeds of his most enduring ideas. The concept of the collective unconscious was born from the realization that his visions carried not only personal but collective meaning. The theory of archetypes grew from his dialogues with figures like Philemon, the shadow, and the animate. The process of individuation, the lifelong journey toward wholeness, was forged in the crucible of these inner battles. And the practice of active imagination itself, which he later taught to others, was nothing less than the method he had used to survive. For creativity, the lesson is clear. Great art, great thought, great innovation often arise from the same tension Jung endured, the confrontation with forces larger than oneself. To repress them is to live narrowly, cut off from vitality. To be overwhelmed by them is to risk collapse. But to engage them consciously, to record, to reflect, to integrate, is to transform chaos into creation. Jung knew he was not alone in walking this line. He saw it in history's visionaries, prophets, poets, and artists who had wrestled with visions and shadows. Some were destroyed by the intensity of their inner worlds. Others emerged transformed, bearing works that reshaped culture. Madness and genius, he realized, are neighbors. The boundary between them is not the content of one's visions but the discipline with which one engages. The Stoics would have recognized this principle in their own way. Seneca wrote, "Most powerful is he who has himself in his own power." For Jung, active imagination was a way of doing precisely that, engaging the powers of the unconscious without being enslaved by them. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that he could not control events, only his responses. Jung applied the same discipline inward. He could not stop the visions, but he could decide how to meet them. The risk of Jung's descent was madness. The reward was a psychology that continues to shape how we understand dreams, creativity, and the hidden life of the mind. More personally, the reward was survival. By entering dialogue with the unconscious, Jung kept himself from being destroyed by it. By giving form to the voices within, he integrated them into a vision of wholeness that would guide not only his own life but the lives of countless others. And so the story of Jung's confrontation with the unconscious is not only his. It is an allegory for anyone who has faced inner chaos, anyone who has wondered whether their imagination was a gift or a curse. The answer is both. The danger never disappears, but the possibility of transformation lies in how we engage it. Jung walked into the depths and returned with a map. He showed that the unconscious is not simply a threat to be suppressed but a universe to be explored. The descent carries risks, madness, isolation, terror, yet the reward is profound: creativity, wisdom, and the chance to become whole. In the end, the question remains for each of us: when the unconscious rises, when images disturb us, when dreams linger with strange intensity, will we flee, or will we dare to listen? Defining the practice active imagination. The words sound simple, almost casual, but behind them lies one of Jung's most daring contributions to psychology and one of the most misunderstood techniques in modern thought. To many, the idea of conversing with images or voices from the mind sounds like fantasy. To skeptics, it borders on delusion. Yet for Jung, this practice was neither idle reverie nor descent into madness. It was a disciplined method for exploring the unconscious, a way of engaging with the inner world not as a passive dreamer, but as a conscious participant. To define active imagination, one must first understand what Jung meant by the unconscious. Freud had taught that the unconscious was a vault of repressed drives and forbidden wishes, mostly sexual and aggressive in nature. Jung respected Freud's discoveries, but he knew they described only one layer of the psyche. Beneath personal repression, Jung found a deeper structure, a symbolic dimension filled with mythic images, archetypal patterns, and collective memories. This was not chaos but a living landscape, one that spoke in dreams, visions, and symbols. The challenge was how to hear its voice without being consumed by it. Active imagination was Jung's solution. It was the bridge between conscious awareness and this symbolic underworld. Unlike passive daydreaming, where the mind drifts wherever it pleases, active imagination requires focus. Unlike hallucination, where images overwhelm and dictate, active imagination involves dialogue. It is neither submission nor suppression, but a conscious meeting in the middle. Jung described it as the conscious participation in unconscious processes. The practice begins with something small, an image from a dream, a mood that lingers, an emotion that will not let go. Imagine waking from a dream where you saw a door half open. In ordinary life, you would forget it by breakfast. But in active imagination, you do not let it go. You return to it. You picture the door. You ask yourself what lies beyond it. You imagine stepping closer. You open it. You let the scene unfold, not by inventing it, but by allowing it to reveal itself. This act of allowing is the heart of the method. The images are not forced. They are not designed like a story. They rise spontaneously, with a logic of their own. The conscious mind observes, records, and responds. If a figure appears, you speak with it. You ask who it is, why it has come, what it wants, and then you listen. The response is often surprise, sometimes disturbed. They carry an autonomy that convinces you they are more than inventions. They are voices of the unconscious, dramatized in symbolic form. For Jung, this autonomy was essential. He recognized that the psyche is not a monologue but a chorus. The ego is not the whole personality but one voice among many. Active imagination gives stage to the others, the critic, the guide, the child, the shadow, the lover. Each speaks its part, and through dialogue, the self expands. To deny these voices is to remain divided. To listen is to move toward integration. What separates active imagination from fantasy is discipline. Fantasy is idle, indulgent, often serving to escape reality. Active imagination, in contrast, confronts reality more deeply. It insists on recording and reflecting. The visions are not left unexamined. They are written down, painted, shaped into form. They become objects of study. Jung insisted that without this reflective step, the practice risks becoming indulgence. With it, the practice becomes transformation. The genius of active imagination is that it treats the unconscious not as a problem to be suppressed but as a partner to be engaged. The figures that appear, whether hostile or kind, are parts of us, long repressed or ignored. The critic who mocks us, the sage who guides us, the lover who enchants us, they are fragments of the psyche waiting to be heard. By giving them voice, we integrate what was once divided. Take, for example, the experience of an artist paralyzed by self-doubt. In active imagination, she pictures her block as a heavy stone. She sits with it, asks why it is there. In her imagination, a figure emerges, perhaps a stern teacher who scolds her. She asks him what he represents, and he replies, "I am your fear of failing, your protector who keeps you from humiliation by stopping you from trying." In this dialogue, the artist realizes that her block is not laziness but fear disguised as caution. By acknowledging it, she loosens its grip. The dialogue does not eliminate struggle, but it transforms it into meaning. Or imagine someone haunted by anxiety. In active imagination, the anxiety becomes a dark figure that follows him. He turns, asks who it is. The figure says, "I am your vigilance, your need to prepare for danger." The dialogue reveals not an enemy but a protector gone too far. By engaging it, he begins to reclaim balance. These examples show why Jung considered the practice essential. Life is full of conflicts between reason and feeling, duty and desire, hope and fear. Active imagination externalizes these conflicts in symbolic form, allowing them to be seen, heard, and integrate. It transforms inner chaos into dialogue, and dialogue into understanding. Creativity thrives in this space. Writers often describe characters who speak to them, demanding lines the author never planned. Artists paint images that arrive unbidden. Scientists dream solutions that elude them by day. Jung would argue that these are natural eruptions of the unconscious. Active imagination makes this process deliberate. Instead of waiting for inspiration, you enter the dialogue directly. You meet the muse on its own terms. But active imagination is not without risk. Jung knew well that the unconscious can overwhelm. That is why he insisted on balance. After a session, he returned to ordinary life, family, work, daily routines. The grounding of the everyday was essential. To live only in imagination is to drift into fantasy or psychosis. To live only in rationality is to be cut off from depth. The task is integration, moving between worlds, bringing insights from the depths into the light of daily action. The Stoics, though they lived centuries before Jung, echoed this wisdom in their own way. Seneca advised nightly reflection, to review the day as though speaking with an inner judge. Marcus Aurelius filled his meditations with conversations with himself, guiding his impulses, correcting his flaws. Epictetus warned against blindly trusting impressions, urging his students to examine each one before assent. These practices, though rational in tone, mirror the spirit of active imagination, dialogue with the inner world as a path to mastery. So what is active imagination? It is not a trick of fantasy. It is not escape. It is a method of survival, creativity, and transformation. It is the art of listening to the unconscious with respect and discipline. It is the recognition that the mind is not a single voice but a chorus, and that wisdom arises not from silencing the others, but from hearing them all. For Jung, defining active imagination was not a matter of theory. It was born of necessity. When visions threatened to undo him, he discovered that giving them voice saved. For us, the practice remains the same invitation, to listen when images call, to dialogue when figures appear, to give form to what lies beneath. In doing so, we discover that the unconscious is not an abyss to fear but a partner to engage, and in that engagement, we find creativity, resilience, and a step toward wholeness. Jung's for steps. Jung never wanted active imagination to be mistaken for drifting fantasy. He insisted it was a discipline, not a daydream, and like any discipline, it had a method. Over years of trial and error, Jung shaped the practice into four interwoven stages. They were not rigid instructions but guiding principles, steps that could help anyone navigate the unpredictable landscape of the unconscious without being lost in it. Preparation. Every journey inward begins with stillness. Jung believed you cannot enter the unconscious while your attention is consumed by the noise of daily life. To prepare, one must create a boundary, a space in which the ordinary world falls silent, and the inner world becomes audible. Jung often found this in his study, sitting alone with paper and pen. For others, it may come in quiet walks, meditation, or simply closing the door and allowing the mind to settle. The preparation is not merely physical but psychological. It is the willingness to pay attention to something subtle, a dream fragment, a recurring emotion, a sudden image. It might be a house you saw in sleep, a figure whose face you cannot forget, or a gnawing feeling of dread. Jung's instruction was simple: do not dismiss it. Choose it as your starting point. This choice matters. The unconscious is vast, and without a focus, it overwhelms. Preparation creates the entry point, the door through which the dialogue begins. It is like tuning an instrument before a performance, setting the tone before the music begins. Engagement. Once the starting point is chosen, the second step begins, engagement. Here, the fragment is allowed to unfold. The half-open door from a dream becomes an invitation. In imagination, you walk toward it. You open it. You see what lies beyond. The figure you glimpse takes shape. The emotion you felt becomes a scene. The key is not to force but to allow. The conscious mind participates without dictating. Jung compared this to watching a play in which one is also an actor. You are present, attentive, ready to respond, but the script is not yours alone. At times, what unfolds is beautiful. A landscape opens, a river flows, a figure offers comfort. At other times, it is terrifying. Jung often saw floods of blood, seas of fire, grotesque creatures. He did not look away. Engagement means allowing even the frightening images to emerge. The unconscious contains not only light but shadow, not only guides but demons. To engage is to accept both. In this stage, imagination is no longer passive. It becomes a stage on which the unconscious speaks, and the conscious mind watches, participates, and prepares for dialogue. Dialogue. This is the heart of active imagination. Dialogue. Once the image unfolds, you do not simply observe it. You speak. If a figure appears, you ask, "Who are you? Why have you come? What do you want from me?" And then, you listen. The replies often surprise. Jung described being startled by the autonomy of these figures. They did not say what he expected. They argued, mocked, resisted. They offered insights he had not considered. Philemon, the winged old man who became Jung's inner guide, often told him things that reshaped his thinking entirely. Jung realized that the unconscious was not merely echoing his conscious thoughts but presenting perspectives he had never consciously developed. This autonomy is what makes the practice so powerful and so unsettling. The voices feel real. They carry weight, even authority. Jung warned against both extremes. One must not dismiss them as mere fantasy, nor worship them as literal gods. They are symbolic figures, archetypes with wisdom to share, but they must be integrated into conscious life, not obeyed blindly. The dialogue can be tender or confrontational. Jung often argued with his figures, sometimes angrily. He recorded their words, questioned their motives, and reflected afterward. Dialogue meant participation, not submission. It was this balance that made active imagination a practice of growth rather than delusion. Integration. The final step is integration. Without it, the practice risks becoming indulgence, an endless play of images with no impact on real life. With it, the practice becomes transformation. Integration means recording what happened, writing the dialogue, sketching the figure, painting the image. Jung filled journals with his visions, later transforming them into the illuminated pages of the Red Book. By giving the experiences form, he anchored what might have dissolved like a dream became something tangible, something to reflect upon. But recording is not enough. Integration also requires interpretation. What does this figure represent? What part of me does it embody? How does this dialogue connect to my struggles, my relationships, my creativity? Jung insisted that the insights must be brought back into daily life. The unconscious is not a place to escape into forever. It is a realm to visit, learn from, and return from. For example, if a figure appears as a hostile critic, integration means asking, what inner fear or repressed quality does this represent? If the figure offers guidance, integration means asking, how can I apply this wisdom concretely in my choices? In this way, active imagination becomes not an escape but a bridge. The unconscious speaks, the conscious listens, and together they shape a more integrated self. The 4 steps as a whole, when taken together, the 4 steps, preparation, engagement, dialogue, integration, form a rhythm. Prepare by focusing attention. Engage by allowing the image to unfold. Dialogue by speaking and listening. Integrate by recording and reflecting. Jung never meant these steps to be mechanical. They are flexible, adapted to the individual. Some may emphasize painting, others writing, others silent reflection. The essence is not the form but the spirit, conscious participation in unconscious processes. And always, there must be balance. Jung emphasized the importance of grounding after each session. Cook, walk, talk to friends, return to the ordinary world. Without this, the unconscious can overwhelm. With it, the practice becomes a source of renewal. Why the steps matter? The steps matter because they transform imagination from chaos into dialogue, and dialogue into meaning. They give the unconscious a voice without letting it dominate. They make possible what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole. They also reveal why active imagination is different from fantasy. Fantasy drifts without discipline. Active imagination has structure. Fantasy serves escape. Active imagination serves integration. Fantasy leaves one cut off from reality. Active imagination enriches reality with symbolic depth. In Jung's own life, these steps saved. Without them, his visions might have destroyed. With them, they became the foundation of his psychology. They also opened a path for anyone willing to listen to the unconscious with respect and courage. Active imagination, then, is not a vague notion but a concrete method. It begins with stillness, moves into vision, deepens into dialogue, and ends in reflection. It is both art and science, discipline and creativity, myth and psychology woven together. And though Jung discovered it in crisis, the practice remains available to anyone who seeks creativity, healing, or self-knowledge. The unconscious speaks. These 4 steps teach us how to listen. The autonomy of inner figures. One of the most unsettling discoveries Jung made in his descent was the strange autonomy of the figures that emerged in his imagination. They were not vague impressions or blurred symbols. They were personalities, vivid, articulate, and sometimes fiercely independent. They spoke with their own voices, carried their own opinions, and often contradicted what Jung expected. At times they comforted, at times they ridiculed, but what startled him most was that they seemed to know more than he did. This was not the voice of conscious invention. Jung did not feel he was making up Philemon or the other figures who appeared. He experienced them as encounters, as if he had entered a room in which other intelligences resided. These conversations with the inner figures, he wrote, are real. Real not in the sense of external beings, but real in the sense that they carried truths his conscious ego alone could never have produced. Philemon, the wise old man. The most famous of these figures was Philemon, the winged old man who became Jung's inner guide. Philemon appeared in vision as a wise teacher, offering insights that often startled Jung with their originality. He told Jung that the unconscious is not simply a repository of forgotten material but a living realm with its own intelligence. He expanded Jung's understanding of symbolism, teaching him that imagination itself is a form of truth. Philemon represented what Jung later identified as the archetype of the wise old man, a figure found in myths across cultures, Merlin guiding Arthur, Hermes guiding souls, prophets offering wisdom. Jung realized that what humanity had dramatized in story, he was encountering inwardly. Philemon was not Jung's ego speaking back to itself, but the voice of the collective unconscious emerging through symbol. The shadow, the harsh teacher. If Philemon embodied guidance, the shadow embodied confrontation. In his imaginations, Jung met figures that insulted him, mocked him, called out his vanity and ambition. These encounters were painful, but they forced him to see qualities he had denied in himself. The shadow was not evil for its own sake. It was the sum of everything Jung had repressed, disowned, or feared. The autonomy of shadow figures revealed how much of our lives are governed by what we refuse to acknowledge. They spoke truths Jung would rather not hear, but without them he could not grow. By recognizing their independence, Jung understood that the shadow is not something we control but something we must negotiate with, an equal partner in dialogue. The anima and animus, inner counterparts. Another set of figures revealed themselves in Jung's imaginations, the anima and the animus. These were not single characters but recurring presences, the feminine in the male psyche, the masculine in the female psyche. Jung's anima appeared in forms that were alluring, frustrating, and mysterious. She drew him toward qualities he lacked: intuition, emotion, relational depth. At times she was inspiring, at times she was cruel. By acknowledging the autonomy of the anima, Jung saw why men often project onto women, and women onto men. The qualities they seek in the other are often images of the inner counterpart. Without recognizing this, relationships become entangled in projection. Active imagination offered a way to meet the anima or animus directly, reducing the compulsion to demand from others what is really part of oneself. The child and the trickster. Other figures appeared too. The child emerged as fragile and vulnerable, yet also radiant with potential. It reminded Jung of renewal, creativity, and hope. The trickster, by contrast, mocked him, overturned his assumptions, and shattered illusions. This archetype, found in myths as Loki, Hermes, or the jester, destabilized Jung's certainty. Though irritating, it prevented rigidity and restored flexibility. What made these figures powerful was not their content alone but their autonomy. Jung did not simply project qualities into them. They confronted him with perspectives he did not consciously hold. They behaved as though alive. Why autonomy matters. The autonomy of these figures was not an illusion. It was the psyche's way of dramatizing inner conflict and wisdom in forms the conscious mind could encounter. To Jung, this was evidence of the collective unconscious, the shared reservoir of archetypes that shape all human experience. The wise guide, the shadow, the lover, the trickster, these are not inventions of an individual mind. They are patterns that appear across cultures, surfacing in myths, religions, and dreams. By appearing autonomously in active imagination, they revealed themselves not as private fantasies but as universal forces taking personal shape. Their independence gave them authority. One cannot simply silence a figure that mocks, or dictate to a guide who insists otherwise. One must listen, question, and learn. This autonomy is also what makes active imagination so valuable for creativity. Writers often report characters who take over the story, speaking lines the author never planned. Artists describe being compelled to paint images that arrive unbidden. Scientists dream of solutions they could not find by logic alone. These are eruptions of autonomy from within, the unconscious speaking in its own voice. Active imagination is the conscious cultivation of this phenomenon. The balance of respect and critique. Jung insisted that the autonomy of inner figures required balance. On one side lay the danger of dismissal, treating them as mere illusions, robbing them of their wisdom. On the other side lay the danger of surrender, worshipping them as literal beings, losing the ability to question. The task was to respect them as symbolic truths while maintaining the authority of the conscious ego. This balance distinguished active imagination from madness. In psychosis, the ego is overwhelmed, and the figures dominate unchecked. In fantasy, the ego controls everything, and the figures are lifeless. In active imagination, there is dialogue. The ego listens, questions, reflects, but does not surrender. A chorus, not a monologue. What emerges from this practice is the recognition that the psyche is not one voice but many. The ego is not the sovereign ruler but the conductor of a chorus. The wise old man sings of guidance. The shadow growls of denial. The anima whispers of desire. The trickster laughs of illusion. Each contributes to the symphony of the self. To ignore them is to lose harmony. To listen is to become whole. Stoic reflections on autonomy. Even the Stoics, though they did not describe archetypes, understood the autonomy of inner voices. Marcus Aurelius constantly admonished himself in his meditations, writing as if to an inner interlocutor. Seneca spoke of reason confronting passion, treating emotions almost as characters to be argued with. Epictetus warned against trusting impressions without dialogue. In their rational way, the Stoics practiced a form of inner conversation, recognizing that the mind contains forces that must be negotiated, not silenced. Jung's contribution was to dramatize these forces as figures and to insist on meeting them through imagination. The Stoics counseled reasoned dialogue, Jung counseled symbolic dialogue. Both aimed at the same goal, mastery of self through recognition of the voices within. The autonomy of inner figures is unsettling. To meet a voice that mocks you, or a guide that instructs you, is to realize you are not as unified as you thought. But this realization is also liberating. It means you are larger than your ego, richer than your conscious self. The unconscious is not emptiness but a community waiting for dialogue. To engage these figures is to risk discomfort, but it is also to discover depth. Philemon may teach you wisdom you did not know you had. The shadow may reveal truths you were afraid to see. The anima or animus may restore balance to your relationships. The child may remind you of hope. The trickster may shatter illusions that held you prisoner. In their autonomy lies their value. If they were puppets of your ego, they could teach you nothing. Because they act independently, they force you to grow. And so the question is not whether these figures exist out there. The question is whether you will dare to meet them in here, within the chambers of your own imagination. The bridge between reason and imagination. For most of Western history, imagination and reason were cast as opposites. Reason was celebrated as clarity, order, truth. Imagination was often dismissed as fantasy, chaos, or deception. Philosophers praised logic, scientists relied on method, while imagination was relegated to poets, dreamers, and mystics. But Jung believed this divide was artificial and destructive. To him, imagination was not the enemy of reason but its partner. Active imagination was his way of building a bridge between the two. The historical divide. From Plato onward, the Western tradition struggled with imagination. Plato saw images as dangerous, shadows of reality that distracted from truth. The Enlightenment exalted rationality, treating imagination as unreliable. By Jung's time, science often dismissed anything symbolic as subjective illusion. Yet history showed that breakthroughs in thought and art alike rarely came from reason alone. Newton's insight about gravity came after watching an apple fall, but also from years of intuitive speculation. Kekulé discovered the ring structure of benzene after dreaming of a serpent biting its tail. Poets, mystics, and artists had long known that imagination was not merely play but revelation. Jung recognized what modern psychology often ignored: the unconscious thinks in images. To silence imagination is to silence half of the mind. To embrace it without reason is to risk chaos. The task is not to choose one over the other but to weave them together. Active imagination as middle path. Active imagination is the practice that enacts this weaving. On one side is reason, which observes, questions, records, and reflects. On the other side is imagination, which presents images, figures, and narratives. Alone, each is incomplete. Together, they form a dialogue. Imagine this balance in practice. You see a dream image, a locked door. Imagination expands it. You picture yourself turning the handle, stepping through. Perhaps a figure greets you, speaking in strange words. Reason now enters. You record the dialogue. You ask what this figure might symbolize. You reflect on its meaning. Imagination provides raw material. Reason provides interpretation. Each tempers the other. Without reason, imagination drifts into fantasy. Without imagination, reason starves. Active imagination is the bridge that allows them to meet without collapsing into one another. The discipline of integration. The bridge requires discipline. Jung insisted that every session of active imagination end with recording and reflection. Write the dialogue, paint the image, or capture the vision in some tangible form. Then step back and ask, what does it mean? What does it reveal about me? How does it apply to my life? This reflective step is reason at work. It ensures that imagination does not remain a private drama but becomes a source of growth. The figure that appeared as a critic becomes recognized as the voice of self-doubt. The guide becomes acknowledged as the inner wisdom that was overlooked. The strange landscape becomes understood as a symbolic mirror of a conflict. Without reflection, the visions dissolve into chaos. With reflection, they transform into insight. Examples of the bridge in action. Jung himself modeled this balance. In the Red Book, he painted mandalas that arose spontaneously in his visions. They were beautiful, symbolic circles, full of intricate patterns. But he did not leave them unexplained. He studied them, compared them to mandalas in Buddhist and Christian traditions, and interpreted them as symbols of wholeness. Imagination created, reason interpreted. Artists and scientists show the same balance. A novelist may feel a character take over the story. That is imagination asserting autonomy. But the novelist then shapes the narrative, edits the text, and gives structure. That is reason bringing order. A scientist dreams of a solution but must test it, refine it, and prove it. That is reason grounding vision. Every great creation arises from this partnership. The role of the ego. Central to this bridge is the ego, the conscious self that mediates between inner and outer worlds. In active imagination, the ego must participate without dominating. It asks questions, records, and reflects, but it must not silence the figures. Its role is to hold the dialogue together, preventing collapse into fantasy on one side or rigid rationalism on the other. Jung described the ego here as a mediator. It is like a diplomat between two nations, reason and imagination. Each has its language, its customs, its truths. The ego translates, negotiates, ensures that neither overwhelms the other. This mediation is what makes individuation, the process of becoming whole, possible. Stoic parallels. Even the Stoics, though far removed from Jung, understood the importance of balance. Marcus Aurelius urged himself to examine impressions before believing them, a rational practice of testing the truth of appearances. Yet he also wrote vividly in metaphors and images, showing how imagination informed his reflections. Seneca advised reviewing the day as though speaking with an inner companion. Epictetus taught that the mind must learn to govern itself, neither enslaved by passion nor cut off from experience. In their own way, the Stoics practiced a form of inner dialogue where reason guided, but imagination provided form. They may not have painted visions as Jung did, but they too built bridges between the rational and the symbolic. Why the bridge matters today in the modern world, the divide between reason and imagination remains. We prize efficiency, analysis, and data, often at the expense of creativity and depth. We mistrust images, dismissing them as fantasy, yet we consume them constantly in films, advertisements, and digital media. We are surrounded by symbols but rarely reflect on their meaning. Active imagination offers an antidote. It teaches us to honor imagination not as escapism but as revelation, while ensuring that reason remains the anchor. It encourages creativity grounded in reflection, vision balanced with discipline. It is a practice not just for psychologists but for anyone seeking creativity, clarity, or self-knowledge. The ultimate bridge, wholeness. For Jung, the ultimate purpose of this bridge was not only creativity but wholeness. To be whole is to integrate opposites, light and dark, conscious and unconscious, reason and imagination. Without integration, one remains divided, rational but sterile, imaginative but chaotic. With integration, the psyche becomes a dialogue rather than a battlefield. Active imagination is the practice of that integration in real time. Each session is a rehearsal of wholeness, reason listening to imagination, imagination offering vision, the ego mediating between. Over time, this balance fosters individuation, the unfolding of the true self. The invitation, the bridge between reason and imagination, is not theoretical. It is lived each time one sits in silence, recalls an image, lets it unfold, asks a question, listens, and records the reply. It is lived each time one paints a symbol and then reflects on its meaning. It is lived each time one honors imagination with discipline and honors reason with openness. The unconscious speaks in images. Reason interprets in concepts. Active imagination ensures that both are heard. It transforms opposition into partnership, chaos into dialogue, fragments into wholeness. And the question that remains is timeless. Will you cling to reason alone, starving imagination, or will you surrender to imagination alone, drifting without anchor? Or will you, like Jung, dare to walk the bridge, where reason and imagination meet, and where the depths of the psyche reveal their hidden truth? Meeting the shadow. Among all the archetypes Jung encountered, none was more disruptive, more necessary, or more misunderstood than the shadow. In active imagination, the shadow appears in grotesque, hostile, or humiliating forms. It is the voice that insults us, the figure that mocks us, the presence that frightens us. It embodies all we deny, repress, or refuse to acknowledge in ourselves: anger, envy, ambition, fear, desire. For Jung, the shadow was not theory but experience. Figures emerged in his visions that accused him of vanity, arrogance, and blindness. They forced him to admit qualities he preferred to project onto others. What unsettled him most was their autonomy. He did not control what they said. They seemed to know him more honestly than he knew himself. To meet the shadow is to be confronted with the truth that the line between good and evil runs not between people, but within each person. Jung often compared this to myths where heroes must face monsters, demons, or dark doubles. The shadow is the dragon guarding treasure, the enemy that reveals our strength only by being confronted. In active imagination, dialogue with the shadow means listening to its harsh words and asking what truth they carry. A figure that ridicules you may represent the inner critic. A monster that terrifies you may represent a fear you have repressed. By engaging rather than denying, the shadow transforms. Hostility becomes honesty. Fear becomes energy. What once threatened to undo you becomes fuel for growth. History shows the same pattern. Shakespeare's tragedies often dramatize the shadow: Macbeth consumed by ambition, Hamlet paralyzed by doubt. Their downfall comes not because they had a shadow, but because they were unable to integrate. The shadow, denied, consumed them. Jung's insight was that integration, not denial, is the path to wholeness. The Stoics would have recognized this. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily to expect arrogance, betrayal, and greed in others, but also in himself. He urged himself not to be shocked when these qualities appeared, but to master them. Seneca wrote that anger, if left unchecked, becomes madness. Both understood what Jung called the shadow, the necessity of confronting our darker impulses with honesty and discipline. In meeting the shadow, we meet ourselves. The figures that insult, accuse, or terrify us are not intruders but reflections. They are the voices of what we have refused to admit, and until we face them, we remain incomplete. The anima and animus. If the shadow confronts us with what we deny, the anima and animus confront us with what we lack. These archetypes embody the contrasexual aspects of the psyche, the anima, the inner feminine in men, the animus, the inner masculine in women. They are not trivial details of personality but profound forces, shaping our loves, our ideals, our projections, and our creativity. Jung discovered them not in abstract study but in active imagination, where they appeared with startling autonomy. The anima. In Jung's visions. For Jung, the anima emerged as a succession of figures, mysterious women who guided, frustrated, or enchanted. Sometimes they appeared as temptresses, luring him into seduction. Other times as muses, offering intuition and insight. At times, they were cruel, withholding affection or mocking his failures. The anima was never a simple presence. She carried contradictions, embodying both danger and inspiration. What Jung realized was that the anima was not merely his feminine side. She was an archetype, a universal pattern found in myths and dreams across cultures. She appeared as goddesses, witches, muses, lovers. She embodied qualities men often neglect or repress: emotion, intuition, relational depth, vulnerability. By encountering her in active imagination, Jung learned that these qualities did not need to be projected onto women in his life. They could be integrated within the animus. In women's psyche. For women, the animus plays a similar role. He appears as a figure of reason, authority, or sometimes domination. He may arrive as a wise teacher, offering clarity and structure, or as a tyrant, silencing intuition and dictating rigid truths. Like the anima, he is double-edged. He can be destructive if unconscious, but creative if integrated. Jung's female patients often encountered the animus in dreams or visions, figures of men who argued, lectured, or commanded. When unconscious, the animus manifested in rigid opinions, harsh inner criticism, or unrealistic expectations of men. When brought into dialogue, he revealed his positive side, the capacity for discipline, clarity, and creative thought. Projection and relationship. Perhaps the most important role of the anima and animus is in projection. Jung observed that people often fall in love not with who someone truly is, but with the image of their inner counterpart reflected onto them. A man projects his anima onto a woman, seeing her not as herself but as his inner feminine ideal. A woman projects her animus onto a man, investing him with qualities he may not actually possess. This explains both the intoxication of early romance and the disillusionment that often follows. The beloved seems magical, radiant, the answer to all longing, until the projection fades and the real person emerges. Relationships falter when partners are expected to embody archetypes rather than being recognized for who they are. Active imagination offers a way out of this cycle. By dialoguing with the anima or animus within, one reduces the compulsion to project. The man who speaks with his anima in imagination begins to recognize his own need for intuition and emotion. He no longer demands these qualities exclusively from women. The woman who dialogues with her animus discovers her own inner strength and clarity. She no longer relies entirely on men to embody them. Relationships, freed from excessive projection, become more authentic. Creativity and inspiration. The anima and animus also play a profound role in creativity. For artists, the muse is often the anima, a feminine figure who inspires vision, offers images, and demands expression. For thinkers, the animus may appear as the voice of reason, pushing ideas into form. Jung himself credited his anima with guiding him into deeper imagination. Many poets, musicians, and scientists throughout history described similar experiences, though they did not name them as Jung did. Consider Dante's Divine Comedy. Beatrice, who guides Dante through paradise, is not merely a woman but the embodiment of anima, intuitive wisdom leading reason toward transcendence. Or think of Goethe's Faust, where Gretchen embodies anima qualities of innocence and love, while Mephistopheles twists animus into cynicism and logic turned destructive. The archetypes surface in literature because they surface in life. The double-edged sword. Yet Jung warned that these archetypes are double-edged. When unconscious, they distort. The anima can make a man overly sentimental, irrational, or enchanted by projection. The animus can make a woman rigid, argumentative, or enslaved to fixed opinions. Both can sabotage relationships and creativity when denied or uncontrolled. But when integrated, they enrich life immeasurably. The man who accepts his anima becomes more whole, balancing strength with tenderness, reason with intuition. The woman who integrates her animus becomes more balanced, uniting emotion with clarity, receptivity with discipline. Both gain access to creativity, wisdom, and authenticity. Stoic insights on balance. Though the Stoics did not speak of anima and animus, their teachings echo the same call for balance. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself to unite reason with humility, discipline with compassion. Seneca wrote that philosophy without kindness becomes cruelty, while kindness without discipline becomes weakness. The Stoics understood that the self must integrate opposites. Jung provided the symbolic framework, anima and animus as inner counterparts whose integration leads to wholeness. The inner marriage. Ultimately, the anima and animus point toward what Jung called the inner marriage, the union of masculine and feminine within. This does not erase gender but balances qualities often split apart. In myths, this union appears as sacred marriage, hieros gamos, the joining of king and queen, sun and moon. In the psyche, it means no longer being divided. The inner marriage produces creativity and authenticity. The individual no longer depends entirely on external figures to supply what is missing. Relationships become freer, less burdened by projection. Work becomes richer, infused with both logic and intuition. The personality becomes more whole. To meet the anima or animus in active imagination is unsettling. They may arrive as lovers or enemies, muses or tyrants. They may seduce, criticize, or inspire, but whatever form they take, they reveal what the conscious self lacks. The invitation is to listen without surrendering, to engage without being possessed. Dialogue with these figures reveals qualities waiting to be integrated. They show us that love is not only projection but recognition, that creativity is not only inspiration but union, that wholeness requires the balance of opposites. And so the question becomes, have you met your inner counterpart? Have you recognized how much of your desire, your inspiration, your conflict, is shaped by anima or animus? And will you dare to step into the dialogue, not to lose yourself, but to become whole? The wise guide and the child. Among the archetypes that surfaced most vividly in Jung's active imagination were two that seemed opposite, yet in truth belonged together, the wise old man or woman and the child. One carried the weight of authority, insight, and perspective. The other carried fragility, innocence, and the promise of renewal. Jung discovered that both were essential. Without the wise guide, imagination risked drifting into chaos. Without the child, it risked growing sterile, dry, and rigid. Philemon, the wise old man. Philemon was Jung's most enduring guide. Appearing as a winged old man, he offered counsel that Jung admitted surpassed his conscious knowledge. Philemon represented superior insight, Jung wrote, and was a mysterious figure who taught me things I had not consciously thought. He was not simply Jung's invention. He was an archetype breaking through. In myth and legend, the wise old man or woman appears everywhere, Merlin advising Arthur, Tiresias guiding Oedipus, Gandalf leading the fellowship, the Sibyl whispering to heroes. In Jung's visions, Philemon fulfilled this role, grounding him when the flood of images threatened to overwhelm. He embodied the archetype of wisdom, the recognition that truth often arrives from beyond the conscious ego. Philemon's lessons taught Jung humility. They reminded him that knowledge is not owned by the conscious self. Wisdom arises from dialogue with something deeper, whether one calls it unconscious, soul, or archetype. The wise guide is not a possession but a presence. The function of the guide. What does the wise guide do in active imagination? He or she provides perspective. When images threaten, the guide interprets. When chaos overwhelms, the guide stabilizes. When the ego is tempted to inflate, the guide humbles. The wise guide is not infallible, but the archetype points to the possibility that inner wisdom exists, waiting to be consulted. Psychologically, the guide represents the higher functions of the psyche, intuition, insight, perspective. Spiritually, the guide symbolizes the connection to something transcendent. Practically, the guide offers the voice of reflection, the inner teacher who counsels patience, compassion, or courage. The child archetype. If the wise guide represents culmination, the child represents beginning. In Jung's visions, the child appeared as vulnerable, fragile, in need of protection, but also radiant with possibility. Jung saw the child as a symbol of new life, the seed of future potential, the part of the psyche that carries hope even in despair. The child appears in myth as the infant savior, the hidden heir, the miraculous birth, Moses in the bulrushes, Christ in the manger, Horus born to Isis. The child archetype always represents renewal, the fragile promise of a future that must be nurtured. For Jung, the child was not sentimental. It was a serious psychological fact. Every time the psyche undergoes transformation, something new is born within us. That new thing is fragile, easily crushed, yet full of potential. To encounter the child in active imagination is to be reminded that no matter how broken we feel, something in us remains capable of beginning again. The polarity of wisdom and innocence. At first glance, the wise guide and the child seem like opposites, one old, one young, one experienced, one innocent. But Jung saw them as complementary. The wise guide offers perspective from the past, the child offers potential for the future. Together, they complete the cycle of growth. Without the guide, the child is naive, vulnerable to destruction. Without the child, the guide is sterile, weighed down by age. When both are present, the psyche holds continuity, wisdom that protects renewal, innocence that revitalizes wisdom. In creativity, artists often encounter both archetypes. The wise guide appears as the voice of discipline, the mentor within who insists on revision, clarity, form. The child appears as inspiration, the playful impulse that generates raw material. Together, they fuel creation. Too much child, and art becomes chaotic. Too much guide, and it becomes lifeless. Balance is required. The child provides possibility, the guide provides form. In daily life, in everyday life, these archetypes shape how we face challenges. The wise guide helps us endure hardship with perspective, reminding us that suffering is not the end. The child helps us face hardship with hope, reminding us that renewal is possible. Together, they allow us to survive loss, disappointment, and despair without giving up. In relationships, too, their balance matters. The guide encourages patience and understanding, the child encourages openness and play. Without play, relationships stagnate. Without wisdom, they collapse. Integration of both creates resilience and vitality. The Stoics, though they did not speak of archetypes, echoed these truths. Marcus Aurelius constantly invoked perspective, reminding himself of the brevity of life, the vastness of time. This is the voice of the guide, sober, humbling, enduring. Yet he also urged himself to remain open to each moment, to embrace the new day as a gift. This is the voice of the child, innocence, presence, renewal. Seneca, in his letters, spoke of cultivating both wisdom and joy, seriousness and play. Epictetus taught that we are students of life, never finished, always learning like children under a teacher. Their philosophy reflected the same polarity Jung encountered. Wisdom without renewal becomes brittle, renewal without wisdom becomes reckless. To meet the wise guide in active imagination is to encounter a presence greater than the ego, a source of wisdom that surprises us with perspectives we did not know we held. To meet the child is to rediscover innocence, possibility, and the courage to begin again. These encounters remind us that wholeness is not one-sided. We need both, the perspective of age and the promise of youth, the guide who teaches and the child who plays. Life demands discipline, but it also demands openness. Creation requires both seriousness and play. Healing requires both reflection and hope. The psyche, Jung discovered, is not a single path but a cycle. Within each of us lives the elder and the child, the wisdom of what has been and the innocence of what can be. Active imagination makes them visible. Dialogue with them makes them real. Integration makes us whole. And so the question is not whether we carry these figures, they are there, always. The question is whether we will listen to the guide when lost, and protect the child when fragile. For within those two archetypes lies the secret of survival, the wisdom to endure and the innocence to begin again. The trickster and the archetypal drama. Not every figure that rises in imagination comes as a guide, critic, or innocent child. Some appear as disruptors, jesters, liars. They frustrate our expectations, mock our seriousness, and destabilize what we thought was certain. Jung recognized these figures as manifestations of the trickster archetype, a force that is as ancient as myth itself, as mischievous as Hermes, as dangerous as Loki. To encounter the trickster in active imagination is to be thrown off balance, but in that disruption lies transformation. The trickster archetype across cultures, myths tell of trickster gods and figures. In Norse mythology, Loki disrupts order with deception and chaos. In Native American stories, Coyote or Raven plays tricks on both gods and humans. In Greek myth, Hermes steals cattle as an infant, yet also becomes the guide of souls. In medieval courts, jesters mocked kings, speaking truths through laughter. The trickster is paradox. He is foolish yet wise, destructive yet creative. He unsettles certainty, breaks rules, exposes hypocrisy. He thrives on contradiction. Where the wise guide stabilizes, the trickster destabilizes. Where the child inspires hope, the trickster inspires doubt. And yet, both are necessary. Without disruption, wisdom ossifies into dogma. Without laughter, seriousness becomes tyranny. Jung's encounters. Jung himself met trickster figures in his visions. They often mocked him, ridiculing his efforts to understand. They showed him the limits of his seriousness, exposing the ego's tendency toward inflation. At times they seemed cruel, even malicious, but their mockery carried truth. They reminded Jung that no matter how profound his insights, he remained human, flawed, fallible, incomplete. For Jung, these encounters were humbling. The trickster tore down illusions of grandeur, yet he came to see their value. Without them, he might have drowned in self-importance, mistaking the voices of the unconscious for divine revelation. The trickster's laughter kept him grounded, preventing delusion. The function of the trickster in active imagination: the trickster's role is to destabilize the ego. He interrupts certainty, mocks pretense, reveals what is hidden. His methods are rarely gentle. He may lie, deceive, or humiliate, yet behind the cruelty lies a purpose: to prevent stagnation. By breaking rules, the trickster forces growth. Psychologically, the trickster represents the chaotic element of the psyche, the part that resists order, undermines structure, and insists on play. He reveals blind spots, exposes self-deception, and prevents premature certainty. Without him, we become rigid. With him, we are forced to adapt, to laugh at ourselves, to grow. Chaos as creativity. Though disruptive, the trickster also fuels creativity. Many breakthroughs come not from stability but from disruption. The joke that exposes hypocrisy, the paradox that forces a new perspective, the error that leads to discovery, all carry trickster energy. Artists often embody the trickster. Satirists mock political systems through humor. Surrealists disrupt conventional forms with absurdity. Musicians bend rules, creating new genres by breaking old ones. In science, too, the trickster appears. Unexpected results, failed experiments, or accidents often open paths to innovation. Chaos unsettles, but it also creates. The archetypal drama in active imagination: the trickster often provokes archetypal drama. Figures argue, contradict, clash. The unconscious does not present itself as a neat philosophy but as a stage filled with conflict. Guides offer wisdom, shadows accuse, tricksters mock, children inspire, lovers enchant. The psyche reveals itself not as a single voice but as a play. This drama is unsettling, but it is also revealing. By watching and participating, the individual learns to see the psyche's complexity. No one figure tells the whole truth. Each carries a fragment. The drama itself is the message. The self is multiple, contradictory, alive. Wholeness does not come from silencing voices but from allowing them to speak in chorus. Humility and humor. The trickster's greatest gift is humility. By mocking the ego, he prevents us from mistaking ourselves for gods. Jung, who wrestled with visions of archetypal figures, could easily have inflated into a prophet or mystic. The trickster prevented this, reminding him that seriousness without humor becomes tyranny. Humor itself is a form of wisdom. To laugh at oneself is to recognize one's limitations. To endure humiliation with grace is to learn resilience. The trickster teaches this lesson brutally, but effectively. The Stoic lens. Even the Stoics, though stern in reputation, understood the necessity of humility. Epictetus reminded his students that they are not gods but mortal beings, subject to error and fate. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, "Soon you will have forgotten all things, soon all things will have forgotten you." This is trickster wisdom in sober form, the reminder that grandeur is temporary, that seriousness must be tempered with perspective. Seneca, too, saw laughter as a form of freedom. He warned against taking insults too seriously, urging that to laugh at one's enemies is often better than to retaliate. The Stoics may not have painted trickster figures, but they lived by the principle that humility and humor are shields against despair. To meet the trickster in active imagination is rarely pleasant. He will mock you, frustrate you, overturn what you thought was certain. But his disruption is necessary. He prevents rigidity, exposes blind spots, and forces adaptation. He reminds us that seriousness must be balanced with laughter, wisdom with humility, order with chaos. The archetypal drama cannot unfold without the trickster. He is the one who keeps the play alive, who ensures that growth does not stagnate, who breaks rules so new patterns can emerge. Without him, imagination would be sterile. With him, it remains alive, unpredictable, transformative. And so the question is, when the trickster appears, laughing at your seriousness, mocking your pretensions, will you resist in anger, or will you listen? Will you see in his cruelty the seed of wisdom, in his lies the hint of truth, in his chaos the possibility of creation? The trickster may unsettle, but he also frees. He frees us from illusions, from rigidity, from the tyranny of certainty. In his laughter lies the reminder that we are human, and that to be human is to be unfinished, playful, contradictory, and alive. Creativity and the shadow. If imagination is the wellspring of creativity, then the shadow is the force that deepens it. To create is not merely to express beauty or harmony, but to wrestle with conflict, darkness, and contradiction. Jung came to see that some of the greatest works of art and thought emerge not from calm serenity, but from confrontation with the shadow, the repressed, denied, and dangerous aspects of the self. The shadow as obstacle and fuel. For most of us, the shadow first appears as an obstacle. It is the inner critic that whispers we are not good enough, the fear that paralyzes us before we begin, the envy that corrodes our inspiration. When ignored, it sabotages. When denied, it grows stronger, projecting itself onto others, rivals, enemies, scapegoats. Yet Jung discovered that the shadow is not only destructive, it also holds energy. The very qualities we repress, anger, ambition, sensuality, aggression, are the same qualities that, when integrated, fuel creation. The artist who denies rage paints politely but without power. The thinker who represses doubt becomes rigid. The lover who hides desire grows cold. Only by facing these forces can they be transformed into strength. Historical witnesses of the shadow history is filled with creators whose genius was entangled with their shadows. Consider Dostoevsky. His novels bristle with crime, guilt, punishment, and redemption because he himself wrestled with gambling addiction, imprisonment, and despair. His shadow infused his work, making it raw and unforgettable. Think of Van Gogh, who poured his turbulence onto canvas, transforming inner torment into vibrant color and light. His madness and his art were not separable, they were entwined. Or Nietzsche, who stared into the abyss and turned his confrontation into philosophy. His aphorisms burn with both brilliance and bitterness, forged from his struggle with isolation and illness. Each shows the paradox. The very forces that threaten to undo them also fueled their genius. The shadow is both wound and wellspring. Active imagination as safe confrontation. For Jung, the brilliance of active imagination was that it provided a safe stage for confronting the shadow. Rather than being possessed by it, one could dialogue with it. Instead of repressing anger, one could imagine anger as a figure, speak with it, ask what it wanted. Instead of denying envy, one could let it appear, hear its demands, and learn from it. This transformation turns raw emotion into insight. The critic who says you are worthless becomes, through dialogue, the voice of fear that protects against humiliation. By listening, one can thank the critic for its protection while refusing to be enslaved. The monster that terrifies becomes the embodiment of strength repressed. By integrating it, one gains vitality. In this way, active imagination becomes a rehearsal for creativity. The unconscious supplies raw material, dialogue shapes it, reflection integrates it. What was once sabotage becomes fuel. The role of suffering. Jung did not romanticize suffering. He knew it destroys many. Yet he insisted that when suffering is faced, it can be transformed. One does not become enlightened, he wrote, by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The shadow is not an enemy to annihilate but a force to be integrated. Creativity thrives in this tension. Too much repression, and art becomes sterile. Too much surrender, and life collapses. But the balance, facing darkness with courage, giving it form, transforming it into creation, produces works that resonate with authenticity. The Stoic parallel. The Stoics, though less dramatic in language, shared the same principle. Seneca wrote, "Difficulties strengthen the mind, as labor does the body." Marcus Aurelius saw every obstacle as fuel. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. To them, adversity was not an accident but a resource. Jung would agree, but add, the greatest obstacles often come from within. The shadow is not merely external adversity but internal conflict. To face it with courage is to turn it from impediment into path, from obstacle into creative fire. The invitation for the creator, the invitation is clear. Do not flee your shadow. Do not repress it into silence. Engage it. Let anger speak. Let envy take form. Let fear reveal its message. Then record it, paint it, write it, sculpt it, transform it into art, philosophy, or wisdom. The greatest works are born of this transformation. The shadow resisted becomes destruction. The shadow engaged becomes creation. And so the question becomes, what in you have you denied, and what might happen if you gave it voice? Artists and writers of the shadow. If Jung's insight is true, that the shadow is not only a burden but a wellspring, then the history of art and literature is its proof. Again and again, we see that the most enduring creations emerge not from tranquility but from turmoil, not from perfection but from fracture. The shadow does not whisper politely, it erupts, demanding form. Those who find the courage to give it expression leave behind works that speak across centuries. Dostoevsky, crime, punishment, and redemption. Few writers embody the shadow more vividly than Fyodor Dostoevsky. His life was marked by extremes: arrest, near execution, imprisonment in Siberia, chronic illness, and gambling addiction that nearly ruined. His shadow was not hidden. It consumed his days in debts, crises, and humiliations. Yet Dostoevsky transformed his turmoil into novels of staggering depth. Crime and Punishment plunges into the psyche of Raskolnikov, a man torn between murder and morality. The brothers Karamazov confronts the problem of evil, faith, and patricide. These are not abstractions. They are dramatizations of inner conflict, drawn from Dostoevsky's own abyss. In his characters, Dostoevsky let the shadow speak. Murderers, addicts, fanatics, saints, They are not caricatures but complex voices of the human psyche. He did not deny their darkness, nor did he glorify. He exposed it, revealing both destruction and redemption. His genius lay not in escaping the shadow but in descending into it and returning with truth. Van Gogh, madness in color. If Dostoevsky gave voice to the shadow in words, Vincent van Gogh gave it color. His life was a storm of poverty, rejection, and psychological collapse. He sold few paintings in his lifetime, lived in obscurity, and ended his life in despair. Yet his canvases burn with vitality, thick strokes, violent hues, swirling skies alive with energy. Van Gogh's art is not polite impressionism. It is raw, turbulent, fevered. His shadow erupted in his illness, but it also erupted on canvas, transmuted into brilliance. The very forces that consumed him gave birth to works that changed the history of art. To stand before Starry Night or his fields of wheat is to feel both torment and wonder, destruction and renewal. His shadow was not hidden in darkness, it blazed across the canvas in fire and light. Nietzsche, the abyss that spoke. Friedrich Nietzsche confronted his shadow with philosophical ferocity. His writings are filled with aphorisms that burn with intensity. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Nietzsche's abyss was not metaphor. He lived with isolation, illness, and eventual collapse into madness. Yet out of this confrontation came ideas that shook the foundations of Western thought: the death of God, the will to power, the eternal recurrence. These were not ivory tower abstractions but insights wrestled from personal struggle. Nietzsche's brilliance and his shadow were inseparable. He gazed into the abyss and spoke of what he saw. His philosophy, radical and unsettling, remains alive because it was forged in the fire of conflict. The pattern of the shadow in these figures, Dostoevsky, Van Gogh, Nietzsche, we see a pattern. The shadow does not merely torment, it demands expression. Left unspoken, it destroys. Given form, it creates. Jung recognized this pattern in myth as well. Heroes often descend into the underworld, face monsters, or confront darkness before emerging transformed. These stories are not fantasy but archetypal mirrors of the creative process. Every creator must descend, face the shadow, and bring back a gift. The danger of denial. What happens when the shadow is denied? It does not disappear. It projects outward, turning into prejudice, scapegoating, or cruelty. Or it erupts destructively in personal life, addiction, breakdown, violence. Many creators destroyed themselves not because they faced the shadow but because they fled from it, letting it rule unconsciously. The difference lies in engagement. Dostoevsky, Van Gogh, Nietzsche all risked collapse, but they engaged their shadows through art, literature, and philosophy. Others who repress may be consumed without creation. Jung's active imagination was his method of ensuring that confrontation did not devolve into possession. Creativity as transformation. The lesson of these creators is that art is not decoration but transformation. The raw material of creation is not only beauty but conflict, not only harmony but chaos. The shadow supplies intensity, energy, and authenticity. When integrated, it produces works that resonate with universal depth. The Stoics understood the same principle, though in calmer terms. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "What stands in the way becomes the way." To them, obstacles were not hindrances but fuel. Jung would add, "The greatest obstacles are within." The shadow stands in the way, but it also becomes the way. The lives of these creators pose a question to us: what is your shadow, and what would happen if you gave it form? What art, insight, or creation lies hidden in what you fear most? The shadow resists, but it also calls. It insults, but it also reveals. It wounds, but it also fuels. The greatest works of art and thought remind us that wholeness is not achieved by fleeing the shadow, but by daring to face it. And so the challenge remains: will you turn from your darkness, or will you, like Dostoevsky, Van Gogh, and Nietzsche, transform it into creation? Active imagination as creative method. For Jung, active imagination was not only a personal lifeline but a method that could be practiced, refined, and applied. What began as a desperate attempt to keep his visions from overwhelming him grew into one of the most powerful tools for creativity and self-discovery. It was not merely therapy. It was a way of bringing the unconscious into dialogue with the conscious mind, a process that could fuel art, innovation, and transformation. The origin of method. When Jung first turned inward in 1913, he did not have a system. He was simply recording visions, writing dialogues, painting what appeared. But over time, patterns emerged. He noticed that his unconscious responded to certain invitations: a dream image recalled, a strong emotion followed, a fragment of memory pursued. By returning to these entry points again and again, he realized he could summon the unconscious with intention. From this grew the method of active imagination. It was not passive fantasy but deliberate engagement. Jung compared it to holding a conversation with an inner figure. He insisted that the practice had structure. One begins with a focus, allows images to unfold, engages in dialogue, and then integrates the results. It was a method born from necessity but sharpened into discipline. Why it works at its heart. Active imagination works because it honors the language of the unconscious. Rational thought speaks in concepts, but the unconscious speaks in images, stories, and archetypes. To insist on logic alone is to miss the message. To drift aimlessly in images is to drown in them. Active imagination creates the middle path, where reason and imagination meet. By entering into dialogue with images, the unconscious reveals itself in a way the conscious mind can participate in. Figures appear, speak, contradict, provoke. The ego responds, questions, reflects. The process becomes a collaboration. The unconscious supplies material, the conscious mind shapes it. The result is neither chaos nor rigidity, but creativity. A laboratory of the psyche. Jung called his sessions a laboratory of the psyche. In imagination, he could experiment with inner forces the way a chemist experiments with elements. He could confront anger as a figure, negotiate with fear as a voice, listen to wisdom as a guide. Each dialogue revealed dynamics otherwise hidden. For artists and thinkers, this laboratory becomes a wellspring. A poet can converse with the muse directly rather than waiting for inspiration. A painter can let colors and forms arise in vision, then capture them on canvas. A philosopher can wrestle with contradictory voices, giving each their due. What makes the method powerful is its repeatability. Unlike dreams, which come unbidden, active imagination can be practiced deliberately. One can choose to enter, create conditions, and engage. It becomes a discipline of creativity, not just an accident of inspiration. The 4 phases revisited in Part 2, we explored Jung's 4 steps: preparation, engagement, dialogue, integration. As a creative method, these steps become tools. Preparation, the artist begins with a mood, a question, a dream fragment. This is the seed. Engagement, the imagination takes over, building scenes, figures, or symbol. The conscious mind watches, curious but not controlling. Dialogue, the creator interacts, asking questions, listening to replies, allowing surprise. Integration, the results are recorded, sketches, writings, music, or reflections, turning ephemeral visions into tangible art. Through these steps, the unconscious is not only explored but harvested. The raw material of psyche becomes the raw material of creation. Examples of creative application: consider a novelist struggling with writer's block. She recalls a dream of standing at a locked gate. Instead of dismissing it, she re-enters it through imagination. She approaches the gate, hears a voice behind it. She asks who is there. The reply surprises her. A character she had not planned for emerges, speaking lines that reshape her story. Active imagination gives her the breakthrough. Or a painter, haunted by anxiety. He imagines the anxiety as a dark figure. In dialogue, the figure reveals itself as a protector, warning him of failure. By painting the figure, he both acknowledges his fear and transforms it into art. What once paralyzed becomes creation. Even scientists have reported insights that feel like dialogues with imagination. Kekule's dream of the serpent biting its tail was itself an unconscious image. Through reflection, he turned it into the ring structure of benzene. Active imagination provides a way to cultivate such images intentionally. The risk of possession, yet Jung warned of danger. To surrender completely to imagination risks possession, being overtaken by figures without reflection. The line between visionary and deluded is thin. Without integration, active imagination can become indulgence or even madness. The key is discipline. Always return to daily life. Always record and reflect. Always treat the figures as symbolic, not literal. The method works only when grounded in reality. Creativity arises when chaos is given form, not when chaos consumes. The Stoic counterpoint: the Stoics did not practice active imagination, yet their discipline complements it. Marcus Aurelius urged constant self-examination, treating impressions as voices to be tested. Seneca advised nightly dialogue with the self, asking what was done well and poorly. Epictetus counseled that one must not be mastered by impressions but examine them rationally. Jung's method adds imagery to this discipline. Where the Stoics argued with reason, Jung argued with symbols. But the goal was the same: self-mastery through dialogue with the forces within. Creativity thrives when freedom is balanced with discipline. Active imagination today. In modern terms, active imagination resembles practices of journaling, meditation, or guided visualization, but with a crucial difference: the insistence on dialogue. It is not drifting into fantasy but engaging with it consciously. It is not escaping reality but enriching it. Therapists have adapted it for patients, helping them converse with fears, traumas, or lost parts of self. Artists use it for inspiration. Ordinary people use it for self-discovery. Its applications are as varied as the unconscious itself. To practice active imagination as a creative method is to enter the unknown with courage. It means sitting in silence, recalling an image, letting it grow, speaking with it, and recording what emerges. It means facing figures that may inspire or terrify, then transforming them into art, insight, or growth. Jung discovered it in crisis. We inherit it as possibility. The unconscious is always speaking. Active imagination is the method of listening. And for those willing to practice, it becomes more than survival. It becomes creation, the art of turning inner voices into outer works, shadows into symbols, chaos into meaning. The shadow as collective force. The shadow is not only personal. Jung came to see it as collective, woven into nations, cultures, and civilization. Just as individuals repress what they cannot face, societies repress their own truths, projecting darkness onto outsiders, scapegoats, or enemies. And just as the individual shadow, when denied, becomes destructive, the collective shadow, when ignored, erupts in violence, persecution, and war. To understand creativity and the unconscious, Jung insisted, we must recognize that imagination carries not only personal figures but also cultural shadows. The collective shadow in history. The 20th century provided Jung with terrifying confirmation of this idea. He had foreseen in visions rivers of blood and seas of fire before World War I erupted. These were not only his personal fears. They reflected Europe's collective shadow, centuries of rivalry, repressed aggression, and illusions of superiority. In the rise of Nazism, Jung saw another eruption of the collective shadow. The dark archetypes of domination, purity, and power overwhelmed reason. A nation projected its fears and denied qualities onto minorities, scapegoating them with catastrophic results. Here, the shadow was not integrated but unleashed. History repeats this pattern. Empires collapse under the weight of their arrogance. Revolutions descend into terror. Religions persecute in the name of truth. The collective shadow appears whenever groups deny their darker impulses and project them outward. The creative response. Yet cultures also respond creatively to their shadows. Myths, rituals, and art often serve as symbolic confrontations. Greek tragedy forced audiences to witness murder, betrayal, and madness on stage, confronting collective darkness through catharsis. Medieval morality plays personified vices and virtues, dramatizing the shadow as a way to contain it. Modern literature and film continue the tradition, telling stories of corruption, oppression, and moral conflict that reflect society's anxieties. Art becomes the stage where the collective shadow speaks. It offers a safe way to witness horror without unleashing it. Shakespeare's Macbeth allowed Elizabethan audiences to face ambition and regicide. Today, dystopian novels and films dramatize fears of control, technology, or collapse. Each time, creativity channels the shadow into form. The shadow in politics and media. In modern culture, the shadow often appears in politics and media. Leaders project national flaws onto outsiders, immigrants, rival nations, ideological opponents. Media dramatizes villains as embodiments of evil, simplifying complexity into black and white. Social movements, too, sometimes project their disowned qualities onto opponents. Jung would warn, whenever a group demonizes another, the shadow is at work. The hatred reveals more about what is denied within than about the supposed enemy. To integrate the collective shadow requires reflection, dialogue, and creativity, acknowledging complexity rather than scapegoat. Collective creativity, myths and archetypes. Archetypes of the shadow also appear in cultural myths. Every society tells stories of monsters, demons, or villains. These figures embody what the culture fears or represses. Yet myths also tell of heroes who confront these monsters, slay dragons, or redeem villains. The drama of shadow and hero is universal. It reflects humanity's need to face collective darkness symbolically. Consider the myth of the Minotaur, a beast hidden in a labyrinth, fed by the sacrifices of youths. It is the shadow of Crete, violence, excess, shame, contained until Theseus confronts it. Or think of modern superheroes, whose villains often reflect societal anxieties, corruption, technology gone wrong, alien threats. The shadow remains, but imagination transforms it into narrative. The risk of suppression. Cultures that suppress the shadow without symbolic confrontation risk eruption. When fear, hatred, or aggression are silenced, they fester, emerging in violence. Jung argued that collective neuroses are as real as individual ones. Nations, like people, must face their shadows or be consumed by them. Totalitarian regimes exemplify suppression. They censor dissent, deny flaws, glorify purity. But beneath the surface, the shadow grows, until collapse or catastrophe erupts. Creative societies, by contrast, allow symbolic expression. They tell stories, stage plays, make films that dramatize darkness. In doing so, they integrate rather than repress. The Stoic lens. The Stoics, though focused on individuals, also addressed the collective. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, constantly reminded himself not to be deceived by flattery or corrupted by power. He warned himself that nations rise and fall, that pride blinds rulers, that cruelty breeds rebellion. His meditations reflect a recognition of collective shadow, the dangers of arrogance, excess, and denial. Seneca, advisor to Nero, witnessed firsthand the destruction of a ruler possessed by his shadow. He urged moderation, humility, and reflection, virtues meant not only for individuals but for societies. The Stoics would agree with Jung, without self-examination, the shadow consumes. For individuals, facing the shadow means admitting flaws, fears, and repressed desires. For cultures, it means acknowledging history, prejudice, aggression, and projection. Both require courage. Both require creativity. Active imagination offers a symbolic model. Just as Jung dialogued with inner figures, cultures must dialogue with their shadows through art, debate, and reflection. Denial leads to eruption. Engagement leads to transformation. And so the challenge remains, can we, as individuals and societies, face our shadow? Can we see in the figures of myth, in the villains of story, in the fears of politics, not only enemies but mirrors? Can we create, rather than destroy, in the presence of darkness? For Jung, the shadow was not evil itself but potential, energy waiting to be integrated. For cultures, the same is true. Within collective shadows lie lessons, warnings, and truths. To face them is to risk discomfort. To deny them is to invite catastrophe. The choice is eternal, projection or integration, destruction or creation. Dreams as gateways. For Jung, dreams were not random noise from a tired brain. They were the royal road to the unconscious, each one a carefully crafted message in symbolic form. Where Freud had seen dreams as disguised expressions of repressed desires, Jung saw them as revelations, guidance from the unconscious to the conscious mind. They were not riddles to be decoded by universal formulas, but unique dramas that spoke in the ancient language of symbol and archetype. And in the practice of active imagination, dreams became the natural doorway, the first step into dialogue with the depths. The dream as symbol. Jung observed that dreams rarely speak literally. They use images, settings, and characters that condense meaning into symbolic form. A house in a dream may represent the psyche, each room a part of the self. A journey may symbolize development. A stranger may embody the shadow or the animate. These are not puzzles to be solved mechanically, but living symbols that invite engagement. Dreams, Jung wrote, are like letters from the unconscious. Each one carries a message, but the language is symbolic, not linear. To dismiss them as nonsense is to throw away guidance. To take them literally is to misunderstand. The task is interpretation, entering the metaphor, asking what it represents in one's life. Dreams and active imagination. In active imagination, dreams serve as seeds. A dream fragment, a door, a landscape, a figure, becomes the starting point. The dream shows the image, but the imagination continues the story. If one dreamed of a locked door, active imagination begins by approaching it, opening it, and asking what lies beyond. If one dreamed of a figure, imagination allows conversation. Who are you? What do you want? In this way, dreams provide the raw material. Imagination provides the dialogue. Jung himself used dreams this way. When he dreamed of floods, fires, and corpses, he did not dismiss. He entered them through imagination, asking what they meant. Out of these encounters came not only insight into himself but visions of collective crisis, confirmed when World War I erupted. Dreams as warning and guidance. Dreams often warn of dangers before consciousness sees them. Jung noted that patients on the brink of psychological collapse often dreamed of floods, fires, or monsters, images of overwhelming forces rising. Others dreamed of neglected figures or broken houses, symbols of neglected parts of the self. By paying attention, one could hear the unconscious pointing to what was missing, denied, or threatened. But dreams also guide toward growth. A patient struggling with career choices might dream of a road that forks, one path wide and easy, the other narrow but leading to light. Another might dream of a guide, an animal, or a child, symbols of qualities they needed to integrate. Dreams did not flatter, they confronted, yet they also encouraged, pointing toward balance. Collective dreams. Jung was fascinated by recurring dream motifs across cultures. People who had never read myths often dreamed of archetypal figures, wise guides, terrifying shadows, sacred marriages, cosmic journeys. He concluded that the unconscious is collective, that beneath personal experience lies a shared reservoir of images humanity draws upon. This explained why myths feel familiar even to those who never learned them, and why dreams often echo ancient stories. When a dream shows a hero battling a monster, it is not only personal struggle but an echo of universal drama. Active imagination enters this collective theater, allowing individuals to participate consciously in humanity's oldest stories. The discipline of listening. Modern culture often treats dreams as trivial, the accidental firing of neurons. Jung would argue that in dismissing them, we silence one of the psyche's deepest voices. Dreams are not random but purposeful. They show us what we avoid, what we need, what we fear. To ignore them is to cut off half of ourselves. Active imagination is the discipline of listening more deeply. Instead of waking, shrugging, and forgetting, one sits with the dream, sketches the image, re-enters it, and allows it to speak. What was fleeting becomes conversation. What was fragment becomes dialogue. The Stoic parallel. The Stoics, though they did not study dreams, also valued listening to the self. Seneca urged nightly reflection, reviewing the day as if reporting to an inner judge. Marcus Aurelius wrote down impressions, treating them as messages to be examined. Though rational in tone, their practice mirrors Jung's in spirit, attention to the inner voice, respect for subtle guidance, openness to correction. Where the Stoics reflected on waking impressions, Jung extended the practice to dreams, both aimed at self-mastery through listening. Dreams are not trivial. They are gateways. They open into the unconscious, revealing truths disguised in symbol. To engage them through active imagination is to step into dialogue with oneself. The question is not whether you dream, you do. The question is whether you listen. What figure appeared last night? What landscape lingered? What emotion haunted you? What if that was not nonsense but a message? What if you stepped back inside, asked a question, listened to the reply? For Jung, this was not speculation but practice. It saved him, guided him, taught him. For us, it remains the same invitation, to treat dreams not as noise, but as gateways into dialogue with the unconscious, and through it, into the fullness of ourselves. Decoding symbol and myth. Jung believed that dreams are the psyche's natural storytellers. They do not speak in linear sentences or neat arguments but in images and dramas that resemble myths, fairy tales, and sacred stories. To understand dreams, then, is not to solve them like puzzles but to enter into their symbolic logic. Each image is a metaphor, a bridge between the personal unconscious and the collective imagination of humanity. The symbol as living reality. For Jung, a symbol is not just a sign pointing to something else. It is alive, carrying layers of meaning that cannot be reduced to a single explanation. A serpent in a dream may be sexual energy, primal danger, wisdom, or healing, depending on context. A house may be the self, each room representing a part of the psyche. A journey may signify growth, exile, or quest. What makes symbols powerful is their ambiguity. They resist one-dimensional interpretation. They are not fixed codes but living presences, charged with psychic energy. To work with them requires openness, not dogma. The dreamer must ask, what does this mean for me now? Jung insisted that no dictionary of dream symbols could replace this personal engagement. Myth as collective dream. Jung saw myths as the dreams of entire cultures. The gods, monsters, and heroes of ancient stories are archetypes given narrative form. When we dream of battling a monster, we reenact myths of Hercules slaying Hydra or St. George killing the dragon. When we dream of journeys into the underworld, we echo the myths of Orpheus, Inanna, or Persephone. These myths reveal patterns that repeat across time and place. They are the collective unconscious speaking through story. That is why dreams feel mythic and why myths feel dreamlike. Both arise from the same symbolic ground. By decoding dream symbols, we also rediscover myths. And by studying myths, we learn to decode dreams. The relationship is circular, each illuminating the other. Examples of symbol and myth. Take the dream of falling. Psychologists often reduce it to anxiety. Jung would agree, but he would add layers. Falling is also the myth of descent, the journey into the underworld. It reflects the ego's loss of control, the invitation to humility, the encounter with the shadow. Or consider the dream of flying. It may signify liberation, creativity, or transcendence. But it also echoes myths of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun and fell. The dream may carry both inspiration and warning. To rise is exhilarating, but hubris leads to collapse. Water is another universal symbol. To dream of drowning may reflect overwhelming emotion, but also baptism, rebirth, the unconscious itself. Myths of flood and creation echo in such dreams, from Noah's Ark to Mesopotamian deluges. Water is terror and renewal, chaos and genesis. Each dream symbol draws from the well of collective myth. Each personal image is also archetype. This duality makes dreams both intimate and universal. The risk of literalism. Jung warned against two extremes in decoding symbols. The first is reductionism, treating every symbol as nothing more than a sexual wish or material concern. This was Freud's tendency, and while it revealed some truths, it stripped dreams of their richness. The second danger is literalism, treating symbols as prophecies or external messages. A dream of death does not necessarily predict physical death. It may symbolize change, transformation, or the death of an old way of being. To confuse symbol with fact is to miss its psychological meaning. The proper stance is reverence without credulity. Treat symbols as meaningful, but interpret them psychologically, asking what they reveal about the self. Active imagination and symbol. In active imagination, symbols are not only interpreted but engaged. If one dreams of a serpent, active imagination allows one to enter the scene, to speak with the serpent, to ask what it wants. If one dreams of a house, one can imagine walking through its rooms, discovering what each contains. In this way, symbols are not dissected but live. This experimental approach reveals meaning that analysis alone cannot. The serpent may say, "I am your fear of change." The house may reveal a locked room, symbolizing repressed memory. The act of dialogue transforms symbol into insight. The Stoic perspective. Though the Stoics did not focus on dreams, they too valued symbol and myth. Seneca often used mythological figures as moral lessons, Hercules as endurance, Ulysses as resilience. Marcus Aurelius filled his meditations with metaphors, life as a river, the mind as a citadel. They recognized that symbol and story carry truths deeper than argument. Jung extended this recognition to the unconscious itself. The Stoics used myth consciously. Jung showed that the unconscious produces myth spontaneously. Both point to the same principle: wisdom often arrives through image, not concept. Why symbols matter for creativity. For creators, symbols are inexhaustible resources. They link personal experience to universal resonance. A poet who writes of a bird in a cage may mean her own longing for freedom, but readers feel it as their own. A painter who depicts a labyrinth may express his confusion, but the image echoes mythic journeys across time. Symbols amplify creativity by connecting the individual to the collective. They ensure that art is not only personal expression but also cultural communication. By decoding symbols, creators discover the archetypal resonance that makes their work endure. To decode symbols and myths is not to reduce them to formulas but to engage them as living truths. Dreams offer us serpents, houses, floods, flights, not as riddles but as invitations. Myths remind us that these images are not private but shared, human, eternal. The question is not whether you dream, everyone does, but whether you will listen to the symbols. What archetype walked through your dream last night? Was it the shadow as a pursuer, the anima as a mysterious figure, the wise guide as a teacher, or the trickster as a joker? What myth were you reenacting without knowing? For Jung, decoding symbols was not about control but about dialogue. It was the recognition that our lives are already mythic, our dreams already archetypal, our struggles already universal. To see this is to step into the stream of human imagination, where every personal dream is also a fragment of collective story. Dreams as warnings and prophecies. For Jung, dreams were not merely echoes of the past. They were also anticipations of the future, signals of what was emerging in the psyche before it reached consciousness. At times, they warned of danger. At other times, they revealed potential. To ignore them was to walk blind into one's fate. To heed them was to glimpse what might come. Jung called this the prospective function of dreams, their capacity not only to reflect but to point ahead. Jung's own prophetic dreams. In 1913, Jung began having visions that unsettled him profoundly. He dreamed of floods engulfing Europe, rivers of blood, and seas of corpses. At first, he feared he was losing his mind. But within a year, World War I broke out, confirming his sense that his dreams had been prophetic, not in the literal sense of predicting events, but in the symbolic sense of anticipating a collective eruption of violence. For Jung, this experience was transformative. He realized that dreams can reflect not only personal struggles but also collective movements. The unconscious is not confined to the individual. It is shared, and its warnings can anticipate cultural upheaval. Dreams as personal warnings. On the personal level, Jung saw countless patients whose dreams warned them of crises ahead. A man who ignored his health dreamed of collapsing bridges. A woman repressing her anger dreamed of volcanoes ready to erupt. Another, in denial about an affair, dreamed of being caught in a storm at sea. In each case, the dream pointed to a danger the conscious mind refused to see. Dreams reveal imbalance. They show when the ego is inflated, when emotions are denied, when choices are reckless. They present these dangers not abstractly but in vivid images: floods, fires, falls, betrayals. To take them seriously is to receive warning. To ignore them is to court disaster. Dreams as prophecies of growth. Yet dreams do not only warn, they also reveal possibility. A person struggling with despair may dream of a child being born, symbolizing new life, hope, and potential. Someone facing transition may dream of a bridge, an image of crossing into a new state. Another may dream of meeting a guide or teacher, anticipating the arrival of wisdom. These are not predictions in the literal sense. They are anticipations of what the psyche is moving toward. They show seeds of growth before they flower. Jung called them compensations, balancing the conscious attitude by showing what is missing or what is trying to emerge. The symbolic nature of prophecy. Jung emphasized that dreams are symbolic, not literal prophecies. A dream of death rarely means physical death. It more often symbolizes transformation, the death of an old identity, the beginning of something new. A dream of betrayal may symbolize inner conflict rather than external events. To interpret dreams as literal predictions is to misunderstand them, but to dismiss their anticipatory function is equally mistaken. Dreams show where the psyche is heading, what forces are building, what truths are pressing toward consciousness. They do not dictate fate, but they warn and guide. Cultural prophecies. Jung also believed that dreams can reveal collective futures. He noted recurring dream themes among patients before times of upheaval: dreams of war, catastrophe, or destruction. These were not coincidental. They reflected the collective unconscious stirring with energies that would soon erupt. Cultures, too, Dream myths, films, and stories often carry prophetic warnings. Dystopian literature, for example, reflects collective anxieties about technology, power, or control. These stories are society's dreams, warning of paths that may lie ahead if the shadow is ignored. Active imagination as preparation. Active imagination extends this function. By entering dream images consciously, one can prepare for what they signify. If a dream shows a collapsing bridge, active imagination allows one to re-enter, to ask the bridge what it represents, to dialogue with the figure who appears. In this way, the dream's warning becomes guidance. Instead of fearing the collapse, one learns what needs to be rebuilt. This practice turns prophecy into preparation. Dreams no longer haunt passively. They become active teachers, shaping choices before crises strike. The Stoic attitude toward warning. The Stoics did not believe in prophetic dreams in Jung's sense, but they shared the principle of preparation. Marcus Aurelius wrote that each morning he expected to meet arrogance, betrayal, and cruelty. By anticipating them, he was not surprised. Seneca advised rehearsing adversity in the mind, imagining loss, exile, or death, so that when such things came, they would not overwhelm. In a way, the Stoics practiced a form of waking prophecy, not of supernatural visions, but of rational expectation. Jung's insight added a symbolic depth. The psyche itself anticipates, through dreams, the trials and transformations ahead. Warnings ignored. History and personal life alike show the cost of ignoring such warnings. Nations that repress their collective shadows often dream in their myths and stories of collapse, but ignore them until crisis erupts. Individuals who dismiss dreams often find their warnings realized in illness, breakdown, or conflict. Jung insisted, the unconscious speaks whether we listen or not. The only choice is whether to engage or be blindsided. To see dreams as warnings and prophesize is not to indulge superstition but to respect the psyche's wisdom. They are anticipations, symbols of forces moving toward the surface. They tell us where we are unbalanced, what dangers we ignore, what potentials we deny. The invitation is to listen. What storm brewed in your last dream? What birth? What death? What figure pointed the way? Was it a warning of danger, or a prophecy of growth? What if you took it seriously? What if you entered it, dialogued with it, integrated it? For Jung, this practice was not optional. It saved him, guided him, and revealed truths beyond his conscious grasp. For us, it remains the same challenge, to recognize dreams not only as echoes of yesterday but as anticipations of tomorrow, warning us of danger, inviting us toward transformation. Integrating dreams into daily life. For Jung, dreams were not meant to remain as private fantasies or curiosities. They were guidance, fragments of meaning that demanded integration into daily life. Without integration, they fade like smoke at dawn. With integration, they become catalysts for growth, creativity, and transformation. Dreams are bridges. They connect the unconscious with waking existence, but only if we choose to cross. From night to morning, the first discipline. Integration begins upon waking. Most people forget their dreams within minutes. Jung urged patients to record them immediately, before they dissolve. This act of writing or sketching is the first step of honoring the unconscious. It says, your message matters. Keeping a dream journal creates continuity. Over time, patterns emerge, recurring symbols, figures, or landscapes. What seemed trivial one night may reveal significance in the larger narrative. Just as myths unfold over chapters, the psyche tells its story across dreams. Journaling preserves the thread. To write a dream is not simply to capture memory. It is already an act of integration. The dream leaves the inner world and enters the page. It becomes an object of reflection, dialogue, and creation. Reflection and interpretation. Once recorded, dreams call for reflection. Jung rejected mechanical dream dictionaries that reduce symbols to universal formulas. Instead, he insisted on context. A snake in one dream may symbolize wisdom, in another, danger. The meaning arises in dialogue with the dreamer's life. Jung encouraged asking questions. What emotion did I feel? What situation in my life mirrors this image? What part of me does this figure represent? In this way, interpretation becomes a mirror of the self. The key is humility. Dreams rarely flatter. They show what is missing, what is denied, what must be faced. To interpret is not to control but to listen. Integration begins when the dreamer admits, this is my truth, even if I resist. Active imagination as continuation. Reflection is deepened by active imagination. A dream fragment can be re-entered consciously. If a dream shows a locked door, one imagines opening it, seeing what lies beyond. If a figure appears, one speaks with it. The dream becomes dialogue, not just memory. This continuation transforms passive experience into active engagement. The unconscious is given voice, the conscious self participates. The result is not only insight but relationship. The dream figure is no longer forgotten but integrated as part of the psyche. Application to daily life. Integration requires more than analysis. It requires action. Jung insisted that dream insights must be lived. If a dream reveals neglected creativity, one must pick up the brush or pen. If a dream shows conflict with a figure, one must examine relationships. If a dream calls for balance, one must alter routine. Without action, dreams remain abstract. With action, they become transformation. The unconscious speaks not to entertain but to guide. To ignore its guidance is to betray the dialogue. Dreams and relationships. Dreams often reveal relational truth. They show projections, anima and animus cast onto partners, shadows projected onto enemies. Integration means recognizing these projections and withdrawing. For example, if one dreams of betrayal, it may symbolize mistrust not of the partner but within oneself. If one dreams of a critic, it may reflect the inner critic rather than an external one. By integrating this, relationships become freer, less burdened by unconscious demands. The anima or animus, when encountered in dreams, points to qualities to be developed inwardly rather than demanded from others. The shadow, when appearing as a persecutor, calls for acknowledgement rather than projection. Integration brings maturity. Partners are seen as themselves, not as mirrors of our inner figures. Dreams and creativity. Dreams are inexhaustible sources of creativity. Poets, painters, and composers have drawn from them for centuries. Coleridge's Kubla Khan came from a dream. Mary Shelley conceived Frankenstein after a nightmare. Salvador Dali cultivated dream states for surrealist images. Jung encouraged using dreams in this way. Recording them not only preserves their message but provides raw material for art. Sketching dream symbols, writing poems about dream figures, composing music that reflects dream moods, these are forms of integration. They honor the unconscious by giving it expression in culture. For Jung, this was not optional. He painted his own visions, filled journals with dialogues, and created mandalas. Art was his way of integrating dreams. Without expression, the unconscious stagnates. With it, life becomes creation. Dreams and Stoic practice. At first glance, Stoicism and Jungian dream work seem distant. The Stoics prized rational reflection, while Jung embraced imagination. Yet both aimed at integration of the self. Marcus Aurelius urged nightly review of the day, treating impressions as lessons. This rational journaling mirrors Jung's dream journaling. Seneca urged preparation for adversity, which echoes the prophetic warnings of dreams. Epictetus insisted that one must examine inner impressions before assenting to them. Jung would agree, dreams are impressions to be examined before acted upon. For the Stoic, integration meant aligning reason with nature. For Jung, it meant aligning consciousness with the unconscious. Both disciplines require attention, reflection, and practice. Both aim at wholeness. The cost of ignoring dreams. What happens if dreams are ignored? They do not vanish. The unconscious continues to speak, through symptoms, neuroses, projections, or crises. What is repressed returns, often destructively. Jung warned that neglected dreams become fate. The person who ignores warnings of collapse may suffer breakdown. The one who denies shadow figures may project them onto others, fueling conflict. To ignore dreams is to cut off dialogue with oneself. Integration, by contrast, prevents eruption. By listening early, one transforms conflict into guidance. Dreams cease to haunt and begin to teach. To integrate dreams into daily life is to live in dialogue with the unconscious. It begins with writing, continues with reflection, deepens with imagination, and culminates in action. It shapes relationships, fuels creativity, and fosters wholeness. The invitation is simple yet profound. Treat your dreams as real. Not real in the literal sense, but real in their meaning. Record them. Reflect on them. Live them. Every morning brings a choice. Forget the dream and return to routine, or honor it and continue the dialogue. Jung chose the latter, and it reshaped psychology. For us, the choice remains. Will we silence the unconscious, or will we integrate its voice into the fabric of our days? The birth of the Red Book. In the winter of 1913, Carl Jung found himself at the edge of collapse. He had severed ties with Freud, the man he once considered a father figure. His reputation as a rising star in psychiatry was suddenly in jeopardy. And worse, his inner life was unraveling. Floods of images, terrifying visions, and overpowering dreams engulfed him. At times he feared for his sanity. At times he believed he was descending into madness. Yet instead of resisting, Jung made a daring choice. He would record everything. He would write, draw, and paint the contents of his unconscious, no matter how strange or disturbing. Out of this decision came the book that would define his life's work, Liber Novus, or the Red Book. A descent into chaos. The visions began abruptly. Jung saw rivers of blood sweeping across Europe, corpses floating in seas of fire, monstrous figures striding through landscapes of destruction. These were not fleeting daydreams but overwhelming experiences that shook him to his core. When the First World War erupted months later, Jung realized that his inner images had anticipated collective catastrophe. The border between personal psyche and collective unconscious dissolved before his eyes. Yet at the time, he feared he was going insane. He had patience, a family, a career. To function outwardly while chaos raged inwardly was unbearable. He described this period as a confrontation with the unconscious, a descent that tested every fiber of his being. The black books, raw material. Jung's first step was to capture the chaos. He began filling small black journals with raw notes, fragments of dreams, snatches of dialogue with figures, sketches of scenes. These black books were his field notes, unpolished records of visions. They were not written for publication but for survival. The act of writing stabilized. By giving images form, they lost some of their terror. By recording dialogues, he could revisit them later with reflection. The black books became his lifeline, preventing him from drowning in the flood of imagination. From black to red. But Jung was not satisfied with raw notes. He wanted to shape them, to give them permanence and beauty. He commissioned a large, ornate volume bound in red leather. Into this book he carefully transcribed his visions, illuminating them with calligraphy and vivid paintings. This became Liber Novus, the Red Book. In its pages, Jung wrote dialogues with inner figures, accounts of journeys into mythic landscapes, reflections on gods, demons, and archetypes. He painted mandalas, serpents, heroes, and cosmic scenes. The book became not just a record but a work of art, a living document of his descent. The style of revelation. Reading the Red Book is unlike reading Jung's later writings. It does not sound like science but like scripture, myth, or epic poetry. Jung did not censor the voice of the unconscious. He allowed it to speak in symbolic, archaic language. My soul spoke to me, he wrote, and he transcribed its words with reverence. The style reflects the experience, raw, visionary, alive. It is not neat theory but chaotic revelation. Jung later spent decades translating these visions into psychological concepts, archetypes, collective unconscious, individuation. But the seed of every idea was here, in symbolic form. Why the Red Book mattered for Jung personally. The Red Book was salvation. Without it, he believed he might have succumbed to psychosis. The act of recording gave containment to chaos. The creation of art, writing, painting, dialogue, transformed terror into meaning. For psychology, the Red Book was Genesis. Though unpublished in his lifetime, it contained the foundations of his later theories. Archetypes, anima and animus, the shadow, the process of individuation, all appear first in symbolic form within its pages. The Red Book was not his polished theory but his raw discovery. The private work. Jung never intended the Red Book for public eyes. He showed it only to a few close associates. For decades after his death, it remained locked away, a secret artifact. Only in 2009 was it finally published, revealing to the world the depth of Jung's descent. Its release shocked many. Here was the founder of analytical psychology, revealing visions that looked like mysticism, alchemy, even madness. Yet for others, it confirmed the authenticity of his ideas. They were not abstractions but lived experiences. The courage of descent. What strikes readers of the Red Book is Jung's courage. To confront visions of blood, demons, and gods, to converse with figures that mocked or terrified him, to risk madness by recording them. This was no academic exercise. It was an existential wager. He trusted that the unconscious was not chaos but meaning, not destruction but transformation. This is why the Red Book matters. It shows that creativity and self-discovery require risk. One must descend into the unknown, endure the chaos, and trust that form can emerge. Jung's decision to write and paint was an act of faith in imagination itself. The Stoic counterpoint. The Stoics, facing crises of empire, advised discipline in the face of chaos. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations not for publication but for survival, reminding himself daily of reason and virtue. In his own way, Jung did the same, except his text was not rational reflection but visionary dialogue. Both were acts of endurance, methods of staying whole when the world threatened to unravel. The birth of the Red Book teaches us that when chaos erupts, we can create. When visions terrify, we can record. When the unconscious overwhelms, we can dialogue. Jung did not escape his descent, he engaged. Out of it came not only his survival but a psychology that continues to shape us. The Red Book stands as testament. Within the darkest descent lies the seed of transformation. The question is whether we will dare, as Jung did, to give form to the chaos, to trust that imagination is not madness but meaning in disguise. Dialogues with figures. When Jung opened the gates of his imagination, he did not simply witness images, he spoke with. The Red Book is filled with dialogues, written in the style of scripture or drama, between Jung and the figures who appeared. These were not inventions in the ordinary sense. To Jung, they were autonomous presences, voices of the unconscious that spoke truths his ego could never produce alone. The act of dialogue became the heart of active imagination, and the foundation of his psychology. The soul as interlocutor. One of Jung's earliest encounters was with his own soul, whom he treated as a feminine presence and addressed directly. My soul, "Where are you?" he wrote, beginning a dialogue that would continue for years. She responded with words that were often confrontational, chastising him for arrogance, insisting that he descend into humility and face what he feared. This dialogue with the soul reminded Jung that the psyche is not a monologue. It is not the ego alone but a chorus of voices, each demanding to be heard. By addressing his soul as an independent figure, Jung acknowledged that wisdom can come from within but not always from the conscious mind. Philemon, the wise guide. The most famous of Jung's interlocutors was Philemon, the winged old man who became his inner teacher. Philemon appeared first in dreams, then in waking visions. He spoke with authority, offering insights that astonished Jung. Philemon represented superior insight, Jung later wrote. He said things which I had not consciously thought. Philemon taught Jung that imagination is not mere fantasy but a mode of truth. He explained that images from the unconscious are alive, autonomous, carrying wisdom beyond the ego. This conviction shaped Jung's entire psychology, the belief that the unconscious is not just repressed material but a living realm with its own intelligence. The shadow as critic. Not all dialogues were comforting. Some figures mocked Jung, calling him vain, arrogant, blind. These voices embodied his shadow, the repressed qualities he preferred to deny. They forced him to confront his flaws, to admit weakness, to acknowledge that he was not as noble as he wished to believe. Though painful, these dialogues were transformative. By hearing his shadow accuse him, Jung learned humility. He realized that the unconscious does not flatter, it exposes. It shows what the ego hides. Without these dialogues, he might have remained inflated. With them, he became grounded. Anima figures. The anima also appeared in Jung's imaginations, mysterious female figures who guided or seduced him, who inspired insight but also tempted him toward danger. They embodied the inner feminine, the qualities of intuition, emotion, and relatedness that his rational mind lacked. Through dialogue with anima figures, Jung learned that men often project these qualities onto women, demanding from partners what they must find within themselves. By conversing with the anima directly, he began to integrate her qualities consciously rather than unconsciously projecting them outward. The trickster. At times, Jung encountered figures who disrupted, mocked, or confused him. They lied, laughed, overturned expectation. These were trickster figures, embodiments of chaos and paradox. Though frustrating, their role was necessary. They prevented Jung from taking his visions too literally, reminding him to remain humble, playful, and cautious of delusion. The trickster taught him that the unconscious is not only wise but also mischievous. It must be respected but never blindly obeyed. The autonomy of voices. What struck Jung most about these dialogues was their autonomy. The figures said things he did not plan. They surprised, contradicted, and instructed him. They behaved like independent beings, though he knew they arose from the unconscious. This autonomy convinced Jung that the psyche is not unified but multiple. The ego is only one voice. Beneath it are archetypal forces that speak with authority. To become whole, one must listen to them, not silence them. Why dialogue matters. Dialogue transforms imagination from fantasy into relationship. To watch an image passively is to drift. To speak with it is to engage. The unconscious becomes a partner rather than a storm. By asking questions and listening to replies, one enters into genuine conversation. This practice is creative as well as therapeutic. Many artists describe characters who speak back, demanding lines the author never planned. Musicians hear melodies that feel given rather than composed. Scientists dream of solutions. These are forms of dialogue with the unconscious. Active imagination makes the process deliberate. The Stoic parallel. The Stoics, though less visionary, practiced in a dialogue as well. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations as if to an inner companion, correcting his impulses, reminding himself of truths. Seneca described nightly conversations with himself, asking what he had done well or poorly. Epictetus warned against believing impressions without testing them, a kind of rational dialogue with the mind. Jung's dialogues were more symbolic, but the spirit was the same. Wisdom arises when one questions, listens, and responds. Dialogue, whether rational or symbolic, is the path to self-mastery. The courage to listen. Dialogues with figures are not always pleasant. They may insult, terrify, or destabilize, but Jung insisted that they are necessary. To refuse them is to repress, and repression leads to possession. To listen is to integrate, and integration leads to wholeness. The courage required is immense. To speak with a figure that claims to be your soul, your shadow, or your guide is to risk confusion, even madness. But it is also to discover depths of wisdom unavailable to the ego. Jung's psychology was born of this courage. The Red Book shows us what it means to dialogue with the unconscious. It is not passive drifting but active engagement. It is not control but conversation. The figures that appear are not illusions to be dismissed but voices to be heard. The invitation is clear. When a figure arises in dream or imagination, do not ignore it. Speak. Ask who it is, why it has come, what it wants. Listen to the reply. Record it. Reflect on it. You may be surprised. You may be disturbed. You may be transformed. For Jung, These dialogues were not private fantasies but revelations. For us, they remain the same possibility, the unconscious as partner, speaking in images, offering truths the ego alone cannot reach. Mandalas and symbolic art. As Jung recorded his visions in the Red Book, words alone were not enough. The unconscious spoke not only in sentences but in images, and to honor those images, he painted. Page after page of the Red Book is filled with luminous illustrations, serpents coiling, cosmic spheres, mythic figures, landscapes of fire and water. Among these, one symbol emerged repeatedly, almost compulsively: the mandala. Jung came to see it as the central image of wholeness, the psyche's attempt to bring order to chaos. The first mandalas during his period of inner turmoil, Jung noticed that circular images kept appearing in his dreams and drawings. At first, he did not understand. They felt spontaneous, arising unbidden. But over time, he realized that these mandalas, geometric patterns organized around a center, appeared during moments of greatest confusion. They were compensations, the psyche's way of restoring balance. Jung began drawing mandalas daily, sometimes sketching them in his journal, sometimes painting them in brilliant color. Each one was different, yet all shared a common structure, order radiating from a center. He recognized them as archetypes of the self, the organizing principle of the psyche. Mandalas in history and culture. Jung's discovery was not isolated. He found mandalas in Buddhist and Hindu traditions, where they served as sacred diagrams for meditation, maps of the cosmos, and tools for contemplation. He found them in Christian art, in rose windows and circular labyrinths. He found them among Native American tribes, in the medicine wheel and sand paintings. Across cultures, the mandala appeared as a universal symbol of order, wholeness, and integration. Jung realized that his own drawings were part of this collective tradition. His unconscious was speaking the same language humanity had spoken for millennia. The psychological function for Jung, mandalas were not mere decorations. They were psychic operations. When the unconscious threatened to overwhelm, the psyche spontaneously created mandalas to restore equilibrium. The circle represents containment, the center represents orientation. To draw or visualize a mandala is to enact the process of integration. Patients who drew mandalas during therapy often found themselves calmer, more focused, more whole. The image provided structure to chaos, symbolizing the possibility of unity. Jung saw this as evidence that the self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche, expresses itself through symbol when the ego falters. The Red Book mandalas. The mandalas Jung painted in the Red Book are striking. Richly colored, filled with intricate geometry, they blend myth and mathematics. Some resemble cosmic wheels, others are like stained glass windows, still others contain figures, animals, or flames. Each one is both personal and archetypal, his psyche's attempt to hold together the fragments of vision, yet also humanity's universal symbol of wholeness. To turn the pages of the Red Book is to see chaos and order in dialogue. Words record the storms of the unconscious, mandalas respond with images of balance. The book itself becomes a mandala, a circle of descent and return, a container of opposites. Symbolic art beyond mandalas. The Red Book contains more than mandalas. Jung painted serpents and dragons, figures of anima and shadow, landscapes of fire and flood. These were not illustrations of fantasy but expressions of living archetypes. By painting them, he gave the unconscious visible form. For Jung, symbolic art was not secondary to psychology. It was psychology in action. To create images is to participate in the psyche's own language. Art becomes therapy, meditation, revelation, creativity as integration. Here, Jung's practice resonates with the broader role of art in human history. Cultures have always created symbols to contain chaos, myths to explain, rituals to stabilize, paintings to reveal. Art is not luxury but necessity, the psyche's way of integrating what reason cannot. For individuals, creating symbolic art functions the same way. To paint a dream, to sculpt a vision, to write a poem about a figure, these acts transform raw material into form. They prevent overwhelm and foster wholeness. Jung's Red Book demonstrates this vividly. By painting his visions, he survived them. The Stoic perspective. Though the Stoics did not paint mandalas, they too sought inner order through symbol. Marcus Aurelius described the mind as a fortress within, an image of containment. Seneca wrote of the circle of virtue, complete and balanced. Their metaphors were conceptual mandalas, efforts to center the psyche through disciplined thought. The difference is method. The Stoics relied on reason, Jung on image, but both sought the same end, equilibrium in the face of chaos, wholeness in the midst of fracture. Mandalas in modern practice today. Mandalas are used worldwide for meditation, therapy, and art. Psychologists encourage patients to draw them as a way of accessing unconscious states. Artists use them to channel creativity. Spiritual traditions use them for contemplation. Jung would say this is no coincidence. The mandala is not a fad but an archetype. It arises spontaneously because it answers a universal need, the need for order, meaning, and integration. The Red Book shows us that when chaos threatens, the psyche creates symbols of order. For Jung, that symbol was the mandala. For us, it may be a drawing, a poem, a piece of music, a ritual. The form matters less than the function, to give shape to the unconscious, to create a center in the midst of storm. The invitation is clear: when your life feels fractured, when chaos overwhelms, create. Draw the circle, paint the vision, write the image. Let the unconscious speak in its own language. You may find that order emerges where reason alone could not. For Jung, mandalas were not hobbies, they were lifelines. They transformed dissent into discovery. They remain the same for us, symbols of wholeness, bridges between chaos and order, signs that the psyche, even in its darkest night, seeks the light of integration. The Red Book's legacy. When the Red Book was finally published in 2009, nearly half a century after Jung's death, it startled the world. Until then, Jung was known primarily as the sober founder of analytical psychology, a thinker who introduced terms like archetype, collective unconscious, and individuation into modern thought. The Red Book revealed another side, not the professor but the visionary, not the scientist but the artist, not the theorist but the man who wrestled with gods and demons in the theater of his mind. The question then became, what is the legacy of this strange, luminous book? The hidden genesis of Jung's psychology. The first layer of the Red Book's legacy is obvious. It is the hidden source of Jung's psychology. Every major concept that shaped his later work appears first in its pages in symbolic form. The shadow appears as mocking, hostile figures who accuse Jung of arrogance. The anima manifests in mysterious female presences who guide and provoke. Archetypes parade as gods, prophets, magicians, and tricksters. The process of individuation is dramatized as a descent into chaos, a confrontation with figures, and a return to balance. Without the Red Book, Jung's later theories can seem abstract. With it, we see that they were born of lived experience. The Red Book is the raw soil, his later writings are the cultivated garden. The bridge between science and art. Another legacy of the Red Book lies in its form. It is not a treatise but a work of art, handwritten calligraphy, illuminated text, intricate mandalas, mythic paintings. It belongs as much to the tradition of medieval illuminated manuscripts as to modern psychology. By creating the Red Book, Jung demonstrated that science and art are not enemies. The unconscious demands expression in both. Psychology without art becomes sterile. Art without reflection becomes indulgent. The Red Book is the bridge, science discovering itself through art, art given depth by psychology. This blending continues to inspire artists, therapists, and seekers today. Painters create mandalas, musicians compose from dreams, writers enter dialogues with inner figures. The Red Book legitimized such practices, showing that imagination is not frivolous but essential. A testament to inner experience for many readers, the greatest legacy of the Red Book is permission. Permission to take the inner life seriously, to honor visions, dreams, and symbols as real in their own way. In an age dominated by materialism, Jung dared to say, the psyche is alive, and its images matter. This legacy is revolutionary. It encourages us to record our dreams, to dialogue with our shadows, to paint our visions, to trust imagination. It suggests that healing and creativity require dissent, not avoidance. It legitimizes the language of myth and symbol in a world that often dismisses the risk of misunderstanding. Of course, the Red Book is also dangerous. Without context, its visions can be mistaken for prophecy, mysticism, or delusion. Some critics argue that its publication risks turning Jung into a cult figure, obscuring the discipline of his psychology with the glamour of visions. Jung himself feared this. He showed the book only to close friends, insisting that he was not a prophet but a psychologist. The legacy, then, carries a warning: imagination must be integrated, not idolized. The Red Book is powerful because Jung balanced vision with reflection, chaos with structure, art with science. To read it without discipline is to risk imbalance. To read it with discipline is to encounter transformation. The collective legacy on a broader scale. The Red Book has reshaped how we see Jung. Before its publication, many assumed his ideas came from intellectual study. Afterward, it became clear they came from inner confrontation. The Red Book places him in the lineage of visionaries, shamans, mystics, prophets, poets. He was not only a doctor of the mind but also a voyager into imagination. For psychology, this has been both unsettling and liberating. It unsettles those who want psychology to remain purely empirical. It liberates those who believe that the psyche cannot be reduced to data alone. The Red Book insists that psychology must reckon with imagination, myth, and symbol if it is to understand the human mind. The Stoic mirror. Even here, the Stoics offer a mirror. Marcus Aurelius never intended his meditations for publication. It was a private journal of survival. Seneca's letters were personal reflections that became philosophy. Likewise, the Red Book was private, Jung's record of his own descent. Only later did it become public. The parallel is striking. private struggles transformed into public legacies. The Red Book reminds us that some of the greatest contributions to humanity are born not from ambition but from necessity, an individual's effort to stay whole in the face of chaos. The invitation, the legacy of the Red Book is not only historical, it is personal. It invites each of us to create our own Red Book, not a literal illuminated manuscript, but a practice of recording, painting, and reflecting on the unconscious. It suggests that imagination is not dangerous if honored, not madness if engaged with discipline. The invitation is to trust your inner images, to dialogue with figures, to create mandalas of your own. You do not need to be Jung to do this. You need only courage to listen and discipline to integrate. The Red Book is both artifact and living document. As artifact, it is Jung's record of descent. As living document, it is a map for anyone willing to explore their unconscious. Its legacy is the reminder that imagination is not a luxury but a necessity, not chaos but potential meaning. It asks of us the same question Jung asked himself: will you face your visions, or will you flee them? Will you deny the shadow, or will you dialogue with it? Will you ignore the unconscious, or will you create with it? The Red Book leaves us no easy answer. It leaves only the challenge to descend, to listen, to create, and to integrate. For within those pages, Jung proved what remains true for us all, that the depths of the psyche, however frightening, contain not only darkness but the seeds of transformation. Jung and his patients. When Jung first practiced active imagination, it was an experiment born of desperation. He never intended it as a clinical tool. But as he stabilized himself and began sharing fragments with his closest colleagues, he realized this method could be adapted for others. Soon, it became part of his therapeutic practice. Through it, patients were able to give form to inner conflicts, to meet their shadows, to converse with figures from their unconscious, and to integrate what was once unbearable. Active imagination became not only Jung's survival strategy but one of the most daring techniques in depth psychology. From private practice to clinical experiment, after his break with Freud, Jung withdrew from the psychoanalytic mainstream. His reputation was shaken, but rather than rebuild on the old foundation of Freudian theory, he pursued his own path. In his private practice in Kuznect, he began cautiously introducing the principles of active imagination. He encouraged patients not merely to recount dreams but to re-enter them. If a woman dreamed of a dark stranger, Jung suggested she imagine confronting him while awake. If a man dreamed of a house, he might be guided to explore its rooms in imagination. Jung asked them to speak with figures, to write down dialogues, to paint images. At first, patients were hesitant. Many feared madness. But Jung reassured them. The difference between psychosis and imagination is reflection. As long as one records, reflects, and does not surrender entirely, the unconscious becomes a partner, not a tyrant. A Patient and the Tower. One famous case involved a patient who dreamed repeatedly of a tower. Each time, she saw herself outside, circling its walls, unable to enter. Jung encouraged her to use active imagination, to picture herself approaching the door, to imagine opening it, to ask what lay inside. As she did, she discovered rooms filled with strange symbols, manuscripts, old weapons, faded portraits. Each room mirrored forgotten aspects of her psyche, memories repressed, traits denied, potential unexplored. By engaging with the tower, she began to integrate these lost parts of herself. Jung later built his own stone tower at Bollingen, a physical mandala, echoing what his patient had imagined. For both, the tower was not just an image but a symbol of wholeness. Encounters with the shadow. Many patients found themselves confronted by shadow figures in imagination. These were often terrifying, animals that threatened, voices that insulted, strangers who attacked. Jung insisted they listen. What does it want? Why has it come? He would ask. One patient, confronted by a snarling animal, discovered it embodied her repressed anger. By dialoguing with it, she admitted her rage at her family, rage she had never allowed herself to feel. Another, accused by a mocking voice, realized it represented his fear of failure. In both cases, facing the shadow brought honesty. Integration replaced projection. Painting the psyche. Jung also encouraged patients to paint or sculpt their images. He believed art anchored the unconscious, preventing it from slipping away. Patients who drew their dream symbols, snakes, circles, labyrinths, found that the act of painting gave form to chaos. It transformed vague fear into something tangible, something that could be worked with. This artistic practice was revolutionary. It broke with the purely verbal model of psychoanalysis. Where Freud relied on talking cures, Jung invited creation. He believed the unconscious spoke in images, and only images could fully capture it. The therapeutic value. Why was active imagination therapeutic? Because it gave the patient agency. Instead of passively recounting dreams, they participate. Instead of repressing emotions, they expressed them. Instead of being overwhelmed by unconscious figures, they dialogued with. This transformed fear into meaning. Monsters became protectors, critics became teachers, guides appeared to offer wisdom. Patients who once felt powerless discovered that the psyche itself offered resources for healing. Jung compared this to alchemy, the transformation of raw material into gold. The raw material was fear, repression, neurosis. Through imagination, it was transformed into insight, creativity, and wholeness. The criticism not everyone approved. Colleagues accused Jung of mysticism, of leading patients into fantasy. Some feared he was encouraging delusion. Jung responded that the method required discipline. Without reflection, imagination could indeed become psychosis, but with reflection, it was the most direct way to integrate the unconscious. He insisted that patients must record everything, analyze it, and live it out in daily life. Without integration, visions remain indulgence. With integration, they become transformation. The Stoic lens even here, Stoic wisdom resonates. The Stoics urged constant self-examination, treating impressions as visitors to be tested. Seneca described anger, fear, and desire as forces to be confronted rationally. Marcus Aurelius wrote dialogues with himself, reminding his soul of truth. Jung's method was more symbolic, but the purpose was the same, to face inner forces consciously rather than be ruled by them. The Stoics used reason, Jung used imagination, both aimed at mastery through dialogue. The stories of Jung's patients remind us that active imagination is not only for mystics or psychologists, it is a tool for anyone willing to engage. Dreams, symbols, and visions belong to us all. The question is whether we ignore them or converse with. The invitation is clear. When a figure appears in your dream or imagination, do not dismiss it. Speak. Ask who it is, what it wants, what truth it holds. Write the dialogue. Paint the image. Reflect on its meaning. For Jung's patients, this practice was often life-changing. For us, it remains available. The psyche still speaks. The figures still wait. The dialogue is still possible. Modern therapy applications. Though Jung developed active imagination in the solitude of his confrontation with the unconscious, the practice did not remain confined to him or his immediate circle. Over the decades, his method quietly seeped into therapeutic practice across the world. Sometimes it kept its name, active imagination. More often, it reappeared under new forms, art therapy, sand play, psychodrama, guided imagery, even certain forms of cognitive behavioral visualization. The core idea remained the same. Images and symbols are alive, and healing requires not only analyzing them but engaging. Art therapy, painting the psyche. Perhaps the most direct descendant of Jung's practice is art therapy. Here, patients are encouraged to draw, paint, or sculpt their feelings, dreams, and fantasies. The goal is not aesthetic beauty but expression. A patient who cannot describe her grief may paint it as a black river. A child who cannot speak of trauma may sculpt monsters that embody it. This is active imagination in another form. The unconscious speaks in images, art gives those images shape. Jung believed that the act of painting stabilized him during his visions, and modern patients report the same. To create an image is to contain chaos, to give form to what feels formless. Therapists then help patients reflect on their creations, asking what the symbols mean to them, not imposing interpretations. Sand play therapy. Another descendant is sand play therapy, pioneered by Dora Karpf, a Jungian analyst trained by Jung himself. In sand play, patients are given a tray of sand and miniature figures, people, animals, trees, buildings. They arrange these in scenes that reflect their inner world. Like Jung's mandalas, sand play produces symbolic worlds without words. Patients often create landscapes of conflict, villages under attack, monsters lurking, children hiding. As they repeat the process over weeks, the scenes evolve, monsters are confronted, villages rebuilt, peace restored. The tray becomes a stage for the unconscious, a living drama of transformation. For Karpf, sand play was a direct continuation of Jung's Red Book, giving form to the psyche's symbols, allowing them to unfold in images rather than analysis alone. Psychodrama and role-play. Psychodrama, developed by Jacob Marino in the mid-20th century, echoes active imagination through enactment. Patients act out inner conflicts with the help of group members. Someone may play the role of a parent, a critic, a dream figure. The patient dialogues with these figures, externalizing inner voices. Though not explicitly Jungian, psychodrama enacts the same principle. The psyche is multiple, and healing comes from dialogue between its parts. What Jung did in writing, recording conversations with Philemon or the shadow, psychodrama does in performance. Guided imagery and visualization. Modern therapies also employ guided imagery, where patients imagine safe spaces, healing figures, or symbolic journeys. Cognitive behavioral therapists use visualization to rehearse coping strategies or confront fears. While often stripped of Jung's mythic depth, the method still rests on his insight. Imagination is not trivial, it shapes emotion and behavior. For instance, a patient with anxiety may be guided to imagine walking through a forest, meeting a protective animal, and learning to draw strength from it. This echoes Jung's dialogues with archetypal figures. The difference is emphasis. Jung sought wholeness, modern therapists often seek symptom relief. Both, however, demonstrate imagination's power to transform. The neuroscientific turn. Today, neuroscience provides evidence that imagination is not unreal. Brain scans show that imagining an experience activates many of the same regions as living it. To imagine confronting a fear triggers similar neural pathways as confronting it in reality. This explains why visualization can reduce anxiety, improve performance, and even accelerate healing. Jung intuited this truth before science confirmed it. For him, imagination was as real as waking life, because the psyche makes no hard distinction. Modern brain science now echoes his claim. The unconscious responds to images as if they were reality. Jung's influence on trauma therapy. Many trauma therapies today, though not overtly Jungian, reflect his principles. Techniques like EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and internal family systems therapy rely on accessing inner images and parts of the self. Patients encounter wounded child selves, protective parts, or inner critics, and engage them in dialogue. This is strikingly similar to Jung's active imagination. In trauma recovery, the unconscious often holds images too painful for words. Dreams and flashbacks return them. By engaging these images consciously, through guided imagery, dialogue, or art, patients begin to integrate what was fragmented. The shadow of trauma becomes part of the self rather than a haunting. The balance of freedom and discipline. Modern therapists who use imagery must walk the same line Jung warned of. Freedom without discipline leads to fantasy. Discipline without freedom leads to sterility. A patient encouraged to drift endlessly into fantasy risks dissociation. A patient confined to rational analysis misses the depth of symbol. The art of therapy lies in balance, allowing imagination to unfold, then grounding it in reflection and action. This balance is exactly what Jung practiced. He allowed Philemon to speak, but he also wrote down the dialogue, analyzed it, and compared it to myth. He painted mandalas, but he also studied their history. He lived in both worlds, vision and reason. The Stoic counterpoint. The Stoics, in their own way, also practiced therapeutic imagination. Marcus Aurelius rehearsed adversity each morning, imagining betrayal, cruelty, and insult, so that he would not be surprised. Seneca advised imagining poverty or exile to strengthen resilience. Epictetus taught that impressions must be visualized and tested before they are believed. Though their focus was rational rather than archetypal, their method resonates with Jung's. Both saw imagination as a tool for preparation and self-mastery. Jung added mythic depth, but the principle remains: the images we entertain shape the lives we live. Modern therapy applications of active imagination remind us that this is not a relic of Jung's private visions. It is alive in art therapy, sand play, psychodrama, guided imagery, trauma work, and even neuroscience. The forms vary, but the principle is constant. Imagination heals when engaged with discipline. The invitation is to see therapy not only as analysis but as creation. Healing comes not only from words but from images, from playing, drawing, acting, imagining. To work with the unconscious is to work with its language, symbol, story, figure, dream. Jung showed the way, and modern therapy continues the journey. The question is whether we, in our own struggles, will take the same risk, to close our eyes, to meet the figures within, to give them form, and to let imagination lead us toward wholeness. The descent and the return. Carl Jung's story of active imagination begins with collapse. A man of reason, severed from his mentor Freud, suddenly overwhelmed by visions of blood and fire, finds himself staring into the abyss of madness. At that moment, most would retreat. Jung did not. Instead, he chose the dangerous path of descent. He wrote, he painted, he spoke with figures that insulted him, mocked him, or taught him. Out of chaos he created the Red Book, a text so strange and beautiful that it still unsettles us today. From this act of courage, a method was born. Active imagination became more than Jung's survival strategy. It became a doorway into the unconscious, a bridge between waking reason and dreamlike symbol. What began as one man's confrontation expanded into a psychology of archetypes, a practice of therapy, and a vision of creativity that still inspires. The shape of the descent. We have followed Jung step by step, his break with Freud, and the visions that threatened to undo him. The dialogues with the shadow, the anima, Philemon, the trickster. The creation of mandalas, the integration of dreams, the birth of archetypes. The Red Book as map of his psyche, both terrifying and luminous. The adaptation of his private method into therapy, art, and culture. The pattern is always the same: confrontation, dialogue, integration. Jung dared to speak with the figures most of us run from. He listened to the voices we repress. He gave form to the chaos we avoid. And in that process, he discovered that the unconscious is not an enemy but a partner. The shadow and the gift. At the heart of this journey lies the shadow. For individuals and for cultures, the shadow is what we deny, repress, or project. Left unacknowledged, it destroys. Faced with courage, it transforms. Jung showed that creativity itself often flows from the shadow, that Dostoevsky, Van Gogh, Nietzsche, and countless others found their genius in what tormented them most. The Red Book teaches the same lesson: every descent hides a seed of growth. The dragon we fear is the guardian of treasure. The abyss we dread is also the wellspring of transformation. The bridge of symbol dreams, symbols, and myths became Jung's bridge. A serpent in a dream, a mandala drawn in the margins, a myth echoed in imagination, all were reminders that the psyche speaks in stories older than any one of us. To decode these symbols is not to solve riddles but to live them, to allow them to shape our lives. By entering dreams through active imagination, Jung showed us how to transform passive fragments into active dialogue. The unconscious becomes not just a mystery but a conversation. This was his gift, to show that the psyche is alive, that it wants to be heard, and that healing comes from listening. The Stoic balance throughout this journey, another voice echoed, the Stoics. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, all insisted on discipline, reflection, humility. Where Jung saw archetypes, the Stoics saw impressions. Where Jung dialogued with images, the Stoics dialogued with reason. Yet both traditions converge on one truth: the self must not flee from inner forces but engage them consciously. Jung's creativity balanced freedom and discipline, imagination and reflection. Without freedom, there is no vision. Without discipline, there is delusion. Both are needed. Jung lived this balance, and his legacy depends on it. The collective lesson: the Red Book is not only personal but collective. Jung's visions of war, destruction, and rebirth remind us that cultures too have shadows. Nations repress their aggression, project their fears, demonize their enemies, and then erupt in catastrophe. Art, myth, and ritual are ways societies practice active imagination, giving their shadows form without violence. When cultures ignore these symbols, they risk collapse. When they engage them, they evolve. The invitation. So what is the conclusion of this story? It is not simply that Jung found a way to save himself. It is that he uncovered a path available to us all. Every one of us dreams. Every one of us has shadows, anima or animus, inner critics, inner guides. Every one of us carries myths in our psyche. The question is whether we will listen. Active imagination is not about pretending or escaping. It is about courage. Courage to sit with a dream image, to ask it what it wants, to let it speak. Courage to paint a vision, to write a dialogue, to create a mandala. Courage to face the shadow, not to destroy it but to integrate. For Jung, this courage turned madness into meaning. For us, it can turn confusion into creativity, fear into insight, fragmentation into wholeness. The return. Every hero's journey ends with return. Jung descended into the depths, but he did not remain there. He returned, bearing gifts, a psychology that honors myth, a therapy that embraces art, a vision that legitimizes imagination. The Red Book was his descent. His later work was his return, the sharing of treasure with the world. And this is where the story turns to us. The descent is inevitable. Sooner or later, each of us faces chaos, loss, conflict, or dream images that unsettle us. The question is whether we will repress them or engage them, whether we will flee the unconscious or dialogue with it, whether we will return empty or transform. The final word. Carl Jung wrote in the Red Book, "I must learn that the dregs of my thought, my dreams, are the speech of my soul." That is his legacy. The unconscious is not waste or noise. It is speech. It is the soul, speaking in symbol. To listen is to live more fully. To ignore is to fragment. The conclusion of this story is not the end of Jung's journey, but the beginning of ours. For imagination still speaks, dreams still visit, shadows still wait, and the choice still stands before us: repression or dialogue, fear or creativity, denial or integration. Jung showed what happens when one man chose dialogue. The Red Book is his testimony. The question left is timeless: will we dare to choose the same?